Hello, hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of Skeptics and Seekers Sunday Sermon Special. Welcome to 5S, and this is a special because we don't have a sermon. Not exactly, although I think that it's going to get a little sermonish up in here. We have got Dale Glover, and Dale we've been going through some of Dale's um, primary research, some things that we have talked about a little bit here and there over the years, but they've never really got the focus and attention that they need, because if you're going to understand Dale, you need to go a little bit deeper into his foundational themes. So we talked about the 11 premise argument. Right after that, Dale did a show with Jordan. What's Jordan's last name, Dale?
I have no idea.
Okay.
But he's the guy from the Atheist from Reason to Doubt podcast.
Smart guy. I like him. I think he's wrong about some things, but Jordan, he did a show with Jordan right after that on miracles, which is actually, I think, another foundational part of Dale's overall thesis. Today, we're going to deal with the math part, and whereas there will be math, I'm not sure that the excitement will be around the math per se. I am calling this show Calculus for Christ because it's good branding, damn it. So
Cool.
we are going to do that, and yet that still will not complete the foundational work for Dale. And so we've talked about this a little bit already. I'm thinking next month we are going to finally have the show that we've probably thought we had in our minds, but we really haven't, which is the existence of God. I don't know if it will be a debate or a discussion, but we, all of us want to hear Dale's primary work and research on his existence for God, because with all of his arguments, we have to just grant the existence of his definition of God in order to move on and evaluate his thesis. And the complaint doesn't just come from me, it comes from other people who read it. Yeah, but you have to justify the God at some point. Dale is going to justify the God. Not today. Today, he's going to justify the math. And I think that this is going to be a very interesting show. I've invited some other people along to help me because I am not a math guy. We've got Brian Y. We have got Darren L. We have got iPhone joining us. How you doing, iPhone?
Good as always.
And Ryan, how's it going?
I am very well. I've got my calculator and I've got my high school calculus textbook in front of me, so I'm ready to go.
Am I the only one who brought an abacus? How old am I? Andrew, I know we went to the same school. Do you remember being taught how to use an abacus?
Oh, I do. Starting back in first or second grade, they had them sitting around the classrooms, and it's actually pretty useful.
Yeah, it's funny. They banned calculators, but they allowed abacuses. Guess it's really easy to tell when you're cheating with an abacus. Lute, how's it going?
It's going good. My father used a slide rule, so.
And the only person that we have not introduced yet, the man of the hours, Dale, how you doing?
Great. I'm great. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. I've enjoyed the last shows because it's going over like my 11 premise argument. We've never done a show on that, and then we're kind of looking into the methodology aspect of it. So I was really surprised when you said you wanted to do math, knowing you were not a fan of the math and stuff. So
no, not a fan of the maths.
Dale, I just wanted to put out there right now that if you can actually demonstrate God with an abacus today, I will convert on the spot.
So I'm going to fail on that because I didn't. But Yeah.
So we are going to give we're going to give a lot of time to Dale. He brought slides. So that's fine. Dale, do you have the ability to share your screen? Because we did not set that up front.
Host disabled, participant sharing screen.
So
Record. Reaction
I'm
submenu.
sorry.
Share screen.
not cutting
Multiple
any of
share
this out.
submenu.
Multiple.
You see the little arrow
Okay.
on
Yeah,
screen?
no, you should be able to share now.
Okay, so I'm doing my opening first.
No,
Okay.
no, I just wanted to make sure that you were able to do it. So, I have made a special request of Dale. I just want to get this business out of the way, because this might come up in the comments, and I just want to head this off. So Dale and I, we knew that this show was coming. Because of my schedule and so forth, I knew that I was going to be late with my write-up. He didn't get my write-up until yesterday, probably around midday. Yesterday, he already had his slide presentation ready, and he went back to redo some of his slides at the last minute. So have a little bit of charity there, and we've just both been busy kind of doing our thing and a lot of last minute stuff. So there may be some things that Dale didn't exactly come prepared to talk about that are in my that's in my write up, but I know that Dale, being a good last minute thoroughbred, is probably going to do well to cover most of it. But if there is something not covered, it's not because he's trying to dodge it. It's because he just didn't have time to prepare for it, and that was not his fault. That was mine. In fact, it wasn't really my fault either. It's just life, and that's how that happened. So the other thing that I requested was to allow me to make my opening statement first. In fact, I didn't really need to make an opening statement on the other shows, but I think this one is kind of important. And so basically what I'm going to do is just go down my write-up and just highlight my bullet points so that I can express the things that I believe people are gonna want to hear, and they'll be upset if nobody brings this stuff up. And so I just want to put this in the forefront as much to let you, the listener, know I hear you. These are questions that you have been asking. I have delivered them to Dale, if not somewhat late, and he is going to address them all, if not in his opening, in our conversation period. So I just want to go through some of those things. So the first thing, and I already said that we're not going to really cover it here because I don't want to burden with Dale with that here. His thesis is already big enough. But in the beginning, God. So it won't be the beginning of our discussions. It might be the last of our discussions on this series, but we are going to swing back around and get to God. Now, Dale is probably not going to convince listeners who don't already believe in God that there's a God, but that's not what's necessary academically. What's necessary is for Dale to make his case and show his work and show his justification. That's all we're asking for there, and that's going to come. 50-50. I think this is a pretty important part. I've got a feeling that this was going to come up in the presentation. Anyway, Dale and I have gone around the houses on this. 50-50 is not a good starting point as far as a null position, in my opinion. I make a longer case for that than I'm going to make here. I'll just try to be very, very brief. If you put numerical, sorry, I'm popping the piece here. If you put numeric values on propositions, and then you sum all of the values, and you get 10% in favor of there being a God. Great. If you start at 50-50, then that 10%, you turn around and say, okay, it's 60% probability that God exists, and that's enough reason to believe. Except that's not true. It's not the math I understand. So, someone can fix this for me. It's like starting halfway up a mountain, uh, and climbing. We don't start halfway up the mountain when we're trying to figure out propositions for things. Uh, it's not 50% possible that God exists, 50% possible that he doesn't. If you're debating someone that's saying, no, God doesn't exist, and you're saying God does exist, you don't start at 50-50 to level the field. You start at 0-0. Both sides have to make their case. Because in the example that I just gave, you didn't end up at 60% pro God. You ended up at 10%. And then you gave yourself 50% for free because you started at 50-50. So that's the problem that I see with Dale's math here in his starting point. I think that it's a very, very generous starting point. An example I gave in the write-up, a lottery ticket, a $1 billion lottery ticket. If it's 1,000,000,000 to 1 odds, save your dollar, you're not going to win. If it's a 50-50 odds, you'd be crazy not to bet. Suddenly 50-50, really nice number, right? And so you're doing the same thing with God by saying, let's just start with 50-50. And you're goosing the odds. 51% is not enough. So this is another of those points. I think it's pretty simply made. We don't have simple majorities when we make laws. Some situations require a supermajority to pass a law. A supermajority is more like 73, 75%, something like that. It has to be really strongly favored to pass because simple majorities are just too close to make certain kinds of changes in government, and we know that. When it comes to safety, airplanes you don't need to have a 51% chance of success. No one would fly. You need to believe anyway that there's a really high chance that you're going to get to your destination. Otherwise, no one would get on a plane. 51% is not enough for everything. Now, it's enough for some things that aren't important. But we're talking about the proposition of our entire lives being spent in devotion to a God that may or may not exist, and we only have one finite life. 51%, 53%, maybe even 60%, if you can get there, and I don't think you can, is not enough. And what is enough? That depends. I'm not prepared to say what should be enough for everyone. I'm just saying that you automatically say, well, I got to 51%, and so you ought to believe. Not good. Forced belief. We don't have to spend much time there. I don't believe that we can force others to believe a thing simply because our math works out, and I don't think we can force ourselves to believe a thing. So even if I could follow someone's math, and maybe I can do it. Maybe Dale can do it. Maybe he can walk me through the math today and say, you see, this is an honest 62% or whatever. I would just say, look, I'm not great at math. You may be right. You may be wrong. But let's call it 62%. I still don't believe it, though, because whereas math is not about emotional numbers, belief is all emotion. It's not something that you do in your head. You can give assent to an idea and not actually believe it. You can look at the numbers and say that it is very safe. 95% safe. If a professional tightrope walker carries you on his shoulder across the tightrope over the Grand Canyon, you'll be fine. Great. Love your numbers. Pretty charts. I'm not going. Right? Gus, I don't believe it. And you can't force that kind of belief. Belief is something, I don't know what triggers belief. I don't know what that mechanism is. Maybe some conversation will be had over that. But for me, the mechanism is not some mathematical equation. That's not what makes me say, okay, well, I see the numbers, I guess I believe. Not with something this big. Assigning numbers to propositions. So I am against using Bayes' theorem in this way, no matter who's using it. I like Richard Carrier. He's not perfect, but I like a lot of his work. But I absolutely hated his work on Bayes' theorem and how he used numbers to, how he used that theorem to suggest that Jesus was most likely a myth. I happen to be a mythicist, a reluctant mythicist. All right, so I don't disagree with Carrier per se. I just disagree with using Bayes for it because Carrier has the same problem that other Christians do. Believe it or not, Dale is not the only Christian who uses Bayes to come up with a formula for faith. You can find him on the Christian side, you can find him on the atheist side, and they both have the same problem as near as I can see. Coming up with their numbers, things that are inherently not numerical. And you've got to figure out a way to assign numbers to things like, virgin birth and such. I don't know how you do it. I will sit very quietly and attentively while Dale explains that. And then finally, I think there's a theological conundrum with the entire enterprise. When I was a Christian, this is not an enterprise I would have engaged in. I would have said, blessed are they who believe without seeing, as opposed to those who believe only because they see. Show me the numbers is a way of seeing. It's a way of seeing. It's a little bit like saying, show me a miracle, and I'll believe. Now, personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But Jesus does. Paul does. Theologically, it seems like an unsound proposition. And so I had much more to say about it in the write-up, but those were my basic points of contention with Dale's theory as I have understood it to this date. And now I will turn it over to Dale for his full presentation. Dale, thank you for letting me get that out first.
No problem.
And I will mute my mic, in fact. So here we go.
All right, cool. Yeah, I think those are great objections. So
Can't
I definitely want to get to them. Like after I do my opening, let's go over them one by one and give my response. But just so the audience knows, in my opening presentation, I'm not going to be responding to what the objections that David just had, unless it's off the cuff or something like that. But mostly, I'm just kind of explaining like what is it that I do, whether it's right or wrong or whatever. How do I use Bayes' theorem to make my decisions about religion? So on that front, I'll show my screen, the video clips. So is that showing up the slides? Calculus for Christ?
Yep.
Okay. That won't get in the way, but okay, cool. So in the first place, the way I have to start is by telling you, well, what is Bayes' theorem proper, right? Because as everyone remembers, I don't use Bayes' theorem correctly, the proper way. I have my Bayes-ish approach. So in order to understand the difference, let's first understand what Bayes' theorem is the proper way, right? So here's just the general theorem. This is the theory, the formula that I use mostly. So it's, look, we're looking for the probability that a given hypothesis is true. This symbol means given the evidence for that hypothesis and our background knowledge or evidence, okay? And the way you calculate that is, well, you have to get the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis. So this is what's called a conditional probability, right? What's the probability that we would see this evidence given we assume the hypothesis is true, times the prior probability? Well, what's the intrinsic probability that the hypothesis is true given our background evidence? So that's what this numerator is, okay? Then that is divided by the numerator again, the same factors, plus now it's the opposite. What is the probability that we would have that evidence given the hypothesis is false, times the prior probability of what's the prior probability that the hypothesis is false given our background evidence? So this is the general Bayes theorem formula. Is that making sense so far, David? Just nod your head if it's
Yeah,
good.
here's the thing. You don't want to ask me whether some math equation makes sense. I was lost in the first 5 seconds.
Oh
But
no.
like I said,
Okay.
I don't think that the real excitement and controversy is on the equations. So we've got
Okay.
other people on the group and in the gallery who are going to be following this a lot better than me.
Okay, cool. So just I guess believe me then. This is just the formula. If you want to use Bayes theorem, this is one of the versions you got to use. Um, why is that not okay? Cool. So here's a secular example, right? What's the probability? The hypothesis is that you have cancer, given the evidence, given the symptoms that you're seeing, and here it is, just plugging into the formula to show you how that works, right? So here you have the probability of the evidence, that you would see these symptoms, given the hypothesis is true, given that you do have cancer, times the prior probability that you of having cancer on the background knowledge. And then, okay, for the denominator, the same thing, plus 1 minus the numerator, the opposite. What's the probability that you would have those symptoms given you don't have cancer? And then this is times, you can't see it because the people are blocking, but times the prior probability that you don't have cancer given the background knowledge, okay? And he does his little calculation, it's 9.1% or whatever. Obviously, he's plugging in some numbers here. Okay, great. So let's look at a religious example, the famous resurrection hypothesis. Now, just so the people understand, I actually don't. When it comes to the proving the historical case for the resurrection or the shroud, I actually don't use Bayes' theorem because there's no cumulative probability. I'll explain that in a bit. But I could have used it for the resurrection hypothesis if I had multiple lines of evidence. It just happens for me, it's only the appearance to the 12 that I think proves a miracle for Christianity or a religion authenticating miracle. So I don't need Bayes because I've only got one line of evidence. But if I had two or more, I would use Bayes to get a cumulative thing for the resurrection hypothesis. But anyways, so just explaining how it works, and our hypothesis here is that Jesus rose from the dead, or God raised Jesus from the dead, right? That's the resurrection hypothesis. So here's again the formula, right? And evidence that would stand for things like, oh, well, the empty tomb, the appearance to the 12, the appearance to Paul, the appearance to 500, whatever the relevant evidence is that we can prove and is relevant to proving the hypothesis is true and or false. Oops, okay, you guys disappeared.
Yeah,
We
no,
would
I
use
just
that.
I got rid of my face because
Cool. Okay, that helps. It's not blocking anymore. So cool. And then B is just the background knowledge or evidence, right? So great. So here's the formula again, right? So the probability that the resurrection hypothesis is true, given the evidence and our background knowledge. So it's the same thing. I'm just plugging instead of H, I'm just plugging in R that represents the resurrection hypothesis. So we have the conditional probability of the evidence, the empty tomb, the appearances, all that stuff, given we assume the resurrection hypothesis is true, times the prior probability of the resurrection hypothesis on the background evidence. And then, okay, the numerator is here again, plus the opposite. What's the probability we would have the evidence given the resurrection hypothesis is not true or is false? Times again the prior probability that the resurrection hypothesis is not true given the background evidence. So again, you see what I'm doing? I'm just plugging in a specific hypothesis into the same formula that we've been using over and over again in all my slides so far. Is everyone following me up to this point at least?
I would ask for others to input there, and not me because all I can do is nod stupidly.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, it would help. Is this making sense? Do I need to go over anything again? Or?
No, Dale, this is Brian, and so far you're tracking a good explanation of Bayes.
Perfect. Okay, cool. All right, cool. So this is how we would apply it. Now, some atheist, believe it or not, who was the first person who ever applied Bayes' theorem to the resurrection hypothesis specifically? It was an atheist, a skeptic, in 1993, Robert Gray Cavett, and he gave a biased version. He basically kind of cheated against the resurrection hypothesis. So how is it that he cheated? So if you remember up here, the way the formula is supposed to be, it's on this part of the equation, you're supposed to have not r. That basically, 1 minus r, that you're saying that the resurrection hypothesis is false. What's the probability you would have the evidence given it's false? What's the prior probability that the resurrection hypothesis is false given the background evidence? Oops, he doesn't have not R. He has this thing that he called AI. Well, what the heck is AI? So essentially, he says AI is the sum of all the not R hypotheses. So you see right here in the formula, it's not the not R symbol that I had here. He's got this evidence given the sum of all non-resurrection hypotheses. So he's adding up. Well, even if there's like a 1% probability of the conspiracy hypothesis, a 1% probability of the hallucination hypothesis, so on and so forth, and he's adding all these up. So you can see right away that this is kind of cheating. If you just even if you come up with the worst hypotheses to explain the evidence, if you have 100 of them, well, you're at 100% right away. So this is how he's kind of cheating in this way, because look, some of these explanatory hypotheses are just mutually exclusive. Just adding these up is not equivalent to the not R hypothesis. So this was, I just wanted to bring this up for interest as to, well, here's an atheist kind of fudging around with Bayes' theorem. So hopefully that makes sense, right? That's not the proper way to use Bayes' theorem. Okay. Now, there are different versions of Bayes' theorem. So another one that is relevant to the resurrection hypothesis is what's known as the odds form. Now, the odds form is different in that it's not getting the total. It's more just comparing two hypotheses to each other, two specific hypotheses. So this would be, hypothesis 1, let's pretend that's the resurrection hypothesis. And you have your formula, same thing as before, the evidence given that the resurrection hypothesis is true times the prior probability of the resurrection hypothesis on the background information. But then you're getting it as a ratio. So the hallucination hypothesis. We've chosen that specific alternative hypothesis, and we're comparing, well, what's the probability of that compared to this? And if the probability of the resurrection hypothesis is higher than the probability of the hallucination hypothesis given the evidence, then you favor the resurrection hypothesis. I don't like using the odds form version because I don't think it really tells us about the truth. I think that we need to prove the resurrection hypothesis is more probable than not before we believe it, consistent with the evidentialism thesis, which I know David takes issue with, and we'll get into that when we get to his objections. But basically here, even if the resurrection hypothesis could only be proven 10%, as long as that's higher than hypothesis 2, then we should believe the resurrection hypothesis. That's what the odds form is kind of saying here. And that's why I don't like it. I don't use this in my calculations at all. But some people have, just so you know. Okay, cool. So here's a little note on the prior probability of the resurrection hypothesis, right? So there's actually a formula known as the Jeffrey conditionalization formula for how we can assess the prior probabilities. And I find a lot of atheists and skeptics assume that there's just a low prior probability on the basis of frequentist arguments and stuff like that, but nobody really goes through the actual elements for how we should calculate that, right? So in this case, what's the prior probability that the resurrection hypothesis is true given the background knowledge? Well, that is equal to the sum of, in the first place, what's the probability that the resurrection hypothesis is true given God exists and our background knowledge? And just so you know, for G, it's a little bit more than God exists. I also add that there has to be a detected religion authenticating context as well. But that's not normally a part of the formula. I'm unique in saying that I think you also need to add that little bit as part of G as well, because otherwise we're playing games of divine psychology. What is God? Is there a context where God would will to do it or not, kind of thing. So, anyways, so this is the formula, right? So that the resurrection hypothesis is true, given the background evidence and God exists and there's a religion authenticating context, times the prior probability that God exists, given the background evidence. And I would say that this is at least 50%, if not higher. But again, that's getting into assumptions of proving God exists and stuff like that.
Let me ask you a question there before you go forward.
Sure.
Just a clarifying question. So you're not saying that God exists is a part of the background evidence, but it is a part of what you are calculating.
Yeah.
If it's not background
Yeah.
evidence, where does it fit into base?
It is technically speaking background evidence, but I wanted to make it clear that we're going beyond just like the background evidence in general when we were evaluating it.
The reason I'm
This
asking
is
is because
beyond.
if it's background evidence,
Mhm.
then wouldn't it need to be either undisputed or you would have to prove it if you're calling it background evidence?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, that's the same for all background evidence, whatever it is, needs to be proven on a balance of probabilities, right? But
Right. But
in this
from the
case,
person outside of, from the outsider looking in, it looks like you've loaded your equation up front with this only works if God exists.
well, again, because remember, it is a conditional probability here, right? We're assessing. It's not even necessarily saying that God does actually exist. It's just saying, look, what is the probability that the resurrection would be true given our established background knowledge and God exists? It's just asking, if God exists, what would the probability be that the resurrection would be true?
So
Um,
your math formula, once again, this is for clarification, I'm not trying to debate. Your math formula is not something that you can use to prove the existence of God.
no,
So
of course not.
what are you trying to prove with it?
This is, we're trying to prove what is the probability that the
The
resurrection
resurrection.
hypothesis is true,
Okay, so
given
just
all of our.
specifically the resurrection is what this formula is about.
Yeah, because that
Can
was
it be
the
used for
example.
anything else?
Yep, you could plug in anything. God exists, or
Well, you couldn't plug in
out
God
of
exists
creativity.
because that's baked into the formula.
For this specific example, yeah, but I'm just saying whatever the hypothesis is, you would have to factor in the background knowledge. And I'm separating out the G here because that's a kind of a key component of the background knowledge that would need to be assessed conditionally. Okay. So
All right, so
if
that's
I
why I'm
plugged in
saying that's why I'm saying that you can't use it to prove God exists because
right,
it's a part of your
right.
background knowledge. And therefore, if you were trying to apply this to, well, let's figure out if God exists, you'd have to come up with another formula.
Exactly, because this is about calculating the prior probability factor. This is we're specifically trying to find just this component
Okay.
of the general equation. Okay,
All right.
so it has nothing to do with the actual evidence and stuff like that. So yeah, but look, we also add to it. Look, the probability that the resurrection hypothesis would be true, given God doesn't exist, or there is no religion authenticating context, as I would include in here, kind of thing, right? But so that would be obviously be extremely low. This is where you would factor in perhaps the frequentist normal naturalist thing. Well, billions of people, none of them have just randomly risen from the dead. Under the laws of nature, it would be extremely low, virtually zero, that the resurrection hypothesis would be true if God doesn't exist.
So look, I know that we're going to swing back around to this when we open up the floor a little bit, but I just needed that for my own clarification. So
Yeah,
I understand this a little bit better.
yeah.
I don't like it
See,
better, but I at least understand. I understand it
this
better.
this is just how this is just how the formula. Like the key for you to remember is whenever you see this little line here, remember we're talking about conditional probabilities.
Mhm.
What's the probability that the resurrection thing is true on the condition of our background knowledge and God exists or something?
Okay.
Same deal with this. It's just the opposite. What's the probability that the resurrection hypothesis is true on the condition that God does not exist?
And
Point zero zero
would
one.
it be fair to say that based on this formula, if we made the condition God does not exist, then you would land on the resurrection would not be true?
It would probably be if you wanted to be because remember Darren Lutz here, right? So he's not going to. You can never have 100% certainty, or on the contrast 0% certainty. So he would probably say, well, if you want to be technically correct, there's like a 0.00000001% probability that maybe Jesus rose from the dead without God doing it. I don't know.
Right, but that wouldn't be
No, that wouldn't actually.
that wouldn't be something that you would put faith on. All I'm saying is that the proposition would fail if you took out the precursor that God exists.
You took yeah, I mean, it's assessing it given God exists. Yeah,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
yeah,
All
if
right.
that's not a part of the background,
All right.
Well, okay.
that
So
changes.
I'm
I
gonna
have
ask.
a.
I'm gonna ask you to hold your powder, Darren. I wasn't actually
Actually,
trying to derail.
I just wanted a
I would like
clarifying
David to.
question.
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead, Darren. I want you to correct me if I said something wrong.
Oh, I'm not trying to correct. I'm just trying to clarify.
Mhm.
So if in this formula we're assuming that it's under the hypothesis that God exists, then someone could easily say one because it was part of God's plan and all that, right? As part of the God exists part. And if we say that the other one it would more likely be zero because a God that doesn't exist can't resurrect a person. So you'd basically have in this formula, you'd have what, 1 plus 0? How
Yeah,
does that get us to our final conclusion?
yeah. So in one sense, remember, God exists here. Doesn't assume that it's the Christian God, right? Um, You could, I mean, if you wanted to plug that in, you could, but I think that's just kind of presupposing Christianity's true already. Like it would be basically 100% then, right? If you put, like, what's the probability that the resurrection is true given the background knowledge and the Christian God exists? Well, then this would be 100%. You won right away
Okay,
because,
so I got to come back in now because I was fine and now I'm confused again. Would you
okay,
define the God that you are using in your God exists formula? What are you talking about?
right here, real maximally great being.
Okay.
Spelled it out for you, see. And
I can't. Those are just little lines for me and Andrew. I assure you, we're not we're not actually following the text. We would have to look at a separate
okay,
slide, and I know that you gave me one, but I don't have it up. So
no problem.
David, if I could just jump in here real fast,
yeah,
because I think you're bringing up an important concern. Whether or not God exists lives as one of the Bayesian hypotheses or as background knowledge, it still needs to be defended and supported. You can't just background knowledge doesn't mean indisputably 100% true. It's still a point of contention that would need to be debated because otherwise you could stick in the background knowledge that all my intuitions are 100% correct all the time.
right.
And so therefore anything you do in the formula is then buttressed by that.
Right, but I'm giving Dale the grant here until we get to his work that God
Well,
exists because he's done the work and we just haven't talked about that. But that's why I was kind of asking if you take that out. So this, since it's a
well,
conditional thing, we could do the condition of God doesn't exist and run the same numbers and see how it
well,
works out.
Yeah, but you're doing that over here anyway. You can't. This part of the formula is correct. What even if it's a fact, God doesn't exist, you would still assess this the same way. Well, if God did exist, then what I think you guys are saying. Don't forget, there's this part here, right, where you times it by. Okay, well, what's the probability that God does exist, given the background knowledge? So that's where we would get into, I guess, the debate about the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, the hiddenness of God. And maybe if what you guys are saying, maybe this is very low. Let's say it's 1%. Well, then when you multiply it, this will be very low as well. And if this, let's say this is 1% and this is, I don't know, 100, let's see, I don't know, even say it's 100% just for the sake of argument. Well, 100 times 1% would mean there's only a 1% probability. Plus, this would be virtually zero. This aspect would be virtually zero. So that would mean you would still have this very low prior probability that the resurrection hypothesis is true.
Sure. So
So I
you're
think
not saying it just because I want you to make I want the audience to know I'm not trying to derail you or be rude. I think one of the things that confused me here was it sounded like you were plugging in the Christian God as a part of your formula,
no,
and that would make it very question begging. But now you're saying no, it's not the Christian God. I bet a lot of people made this mistake. Not just me. So it's not the Christian God that you're saying exists in this formula. You're just saying a philosophically maximally great being. And we're not gonna go over the ontological argument here, but that's also something that even Christians would have over the years disputed. That definition of God. So I just want to be clear. You're talking about the ontological argument, the Anselm God,
yeah,
and not
saw
the God that
fine.
Christians would say God exists. I mean, there are only a few, I think, that are philosophically minded enough to even know what we're talking about here.
But don't correct. But I mean that's fine, right? Like this is what I'm assuming, and I'll spell it out what a real maximally great being is. And remember, that's a minimal definition. It's not inconsistent with the Christian God. A real maximally great being has the properties as I define it minimally, which means it could also have the property of being a trinity. It could also have the property of being the Christian God,
Right. No,
stuff like that.
I get that.
I'm not assuming that because that would be just me begging the question.
Okay.
Christianity is true because I'm assuming that the Christian God exists. So this would be 100% and wouldn't really be useful. I would find really as a prior.
Rather than saying God in this formula, wouldn't it be more intelligible for more people if you just said a being powerful enough to resurrect a person exists? Would that also not be consistent with your formula?
It would. I think it's better to say God because obviously that's going to play a role in my consistency and stuff like that. Like if you're talking about some alien or something that has enough power to raise someone from the dead, that's not really going to be useful when we're talking about is
Right, but you're also not talking about the
religion.
Christian God, and so people are going to assume that you're talking about the Christian God because that's the God that they know, and so when you say God exists, they're going to, that's what they're hearing. Look, I've made the objection that I've made. I understand what you're saying, and I really feel bad, and I want you to get back to your case.
No, I want to make sure you guys are understanding it. So you're right. It's just irrelevant, is what I would say. Like I don't care about. Yeah, we can assess what's the probability that Jesus would rise from the dead, given the background knowledge and a cue from Star Trek or something like that.
It's just it's prejudicial that you call it God.
No, it's not. It's just that's the being we're talking about. And as long as I define my terms by what I mean by God, and I've given this minimal definition here, he's a real maximally great being. Whatever else he is, he's this.
Okay.
Given that, Go ahead.
David's bringing up a great point here, because what it is artificially doing is eliminating parts of certain explanations that fit under resurrection as possible, but doesn't fit under God exists. So you're not setting the binary correctly if you're excluding a whole bunch of explanations that are possible given this formula, but don't fall under this particular narrowing once you make it a God.
Well, so no, I'm not, Brian, because remember, so this is, we're doing God, but don't forget plus here, given not God. So this would include Q as well, potentially, or or all non-God beings that have the power to it. So maybe this isn't virtually zero. Maybe naturalism is false and we have this supernatural non-God being. Okay, so fine. If you want to say this is 90% too, great. This is an addition, right? So the more the merrier. This will help raise the prior probability of God. If you're of the resurrection hypothesis, sorry.
No. What it does is it raises the probability of the resurrection happening, but God not existing. And you can't throw that out of the equation. You got to make sure it's part of the equation.
Okay. So what you're saying here, yeah, and so yes and no, right? So I would agree with you. Some Christians, so Gary Habermas, Mike Lacona, William and Craig, you've got to watch them because when they debate, it's not, I'm not going to call it a subtle trick, but there's nuance. When they define what is the resurrection hypothesis, they're not assuming God's involved in that stuff, right? They're just saying the hypothesis is Jesus rose from the dead. Maybe Q rose him, maybe an alien did, maybe God did, um, whatever, right? So when I define the resurrection hypothesis, this is why I define it that God raised Jesus from the dead. So God is a necessary part of the hypothesis itself. And in that case, then, yeah, this formula is perfect. This is the way you would calculate that, right? Okay,
Okay.
well,
I'm gonna go ahead and step in as moderator and let this be the only time I have to do it because I actually hate moderating.
okay.
Um, everybody hold your fire. Dale has a presentation, and look, I might interrupt for clarity again, but I'm gonna limit it to like 30 seconds worth of clarity because I feel like we've taken Dale off of the path, and we can come back around to this. Dale, go ahead.
Okay.
I'm also gonna get up for a couple of minutes because of something that I have to do here. But please go ahead and
Okay.
continue.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we can come back to this. I would just say like the objections that you guys are, it's not real. Like this formula is what it is. Like I'm not baking in any assumptions, kind of thing. And I'm not assuming that God does exist. If you want, that would be under this factor. Let's say this is 0%, then great. If you want to say, given the background evidence from all the arguments for God's existence, it's very unlikely God exists, then that would be factored into this part of the equation. That has nothing to do with this part. And I'm including this part for non-God beings as well. So that this is non-controversial among mathematicians. This is how you would calculate it, regardless of what the hypothesis is. So let me just move on then, and we can come back to this if you guys want. Okay, great. So now that you guys understand how Bayes' theorem works in general, well, what about my Bayes-ish approach? What are the key differences, right? So this is the formula that I use. This is what I've taught you guys before, right? Um, that this is how you would use the Bayes theorem proper. You would have these conditional probabilities, right? The probability that you would have the evidence given that the resurrection hypothesis is assumed to be true. On the opposite end, well, what's the probability that you have the evidence given we assume that the resurrection hypothesis is not true, is false? So these are the conditional probabilities. I don't like that approach. I think it's simpler. Again, I'm at the time, I'll be honest, in 2014 when I discovered Bayes theorem, I didn't really understand what we were totally doing. And I'm just like, well, this is just automatically 100%, of course, and stuff like that, right? So I didn't get that we were adding this part and that it would give us the percentages. So I came up with a much simpler, direct way. This is the Bayes theorem as I use it, right? So the probability of the resurrection hypothesis is true given the evidence and the background knowledge. But then, whoops, I don't really have a conditional probability here. I have this direct that the resurrection hypothesis is true given the evidence that we have. And I obviously that's referring to the sum of the evidence. So if I think the empty tomb proves the resurrection and the appearance to 500 and the appearance to Paul, I would get the sum of all three of those evidences proving the resurrection hypothesis is true. So you see that this is the evidence given that we assume the resurrection hypothesis is true. What I do is just basically I just plug in through my subjective probabilities the value for R given E kind of thing. And same on the opposite, not that the resurrection hypothesis is false given the evidence that we have, all the relevant evidence. And then this is the same. This is just the prior probability factors. So everything in the equation is true. Is true. This is the only difference that I do. I just give this direct probability per evidence factor that I think is relevant, that actually says 51% or more the resurrection hypothesis is true. Now, obviously, that isn't just, oh, I don't just go the empty tomb and then assume the resurrection is true. I provide my objective reasons behind the subjective probabilities that I give, and I write that out. So that is available for everyone to assess objectively whether my reasons are good or not. But the point is, at this point in the mathematical formula, this is where I plug in my subjective probability values that, in reality, the appearance to the 12 is the only evidence that I think would prove the resurrection. So if I were using this, I would plug in that as 57% because that's what I got back in 2018. So 57% would go in this factor. And then I plug in all the rest of the stuff, right? This, in terms of the not R, the way we calculate that is it's 100% minus, in this case, it would be 57%. So that this factor would be 100 minus 57, whatever that is, 33 or something. I don't know what it is, but that's what we would plug in here. And that, again, that's just part of the formula, 1 minus whatever the numerator is for each of these factors. For the prior probability, we all know this is where I put in 50%. Well, on this front, 100% minus 50% is 50%. So that would be plugged in there. So that's the contrast. What is the difference? It's just these factors in red. I just directly give subjective probability values for this. And really all I'm doing is factoring in the sum of all those evidences, as well as factoring in the prior probability. I'm not using conditional probabilities where what's the probability we have the evidence if we assume the resurrection happened. I'm not getting involved in that stuff. So I hope that's clear as to the difference. Okay. And I gave a comparative illustration here. So, okay, so again, for the sake of argument, let's just assume the prior probability of the resurrection hypothesis is 50%, just for the sake of illustration. I know you guys take issue with it, that's fine, but and then we have the following evidences: the empty tomb, and each of these are relevant, meaning they prove on a balance of probabilities that the resurrection hypothesis is in fact true. So the empty tomb, the appearance to Paul, the appearance to the 12, and the appearance to the 500. And I'm saying, just for the sake of argument, pretend these are my subjective values, right? So, okay, so the proper Bayes theorem. Okay, well, what is the conditional probability that we would have the empty tomb given the resurrection hypothesis is true? Well, that's 100%. Okay, what's the probability that we would have the evidence from the appearance to Paul given the resurrection hypothesis is true? And again, I actually, in reality, these are all 100%, but I made up different values just to mix things up a bit, right? But okay, so how do I move are you guys seeing the bar? Is that blocking?
I'm just seeing the slide.
Assumed to be false. Okay, yeah. So sorry, I screwed up here. So okay, great. So the conditional probability, this factor here, to my mind, it's 100% for all of the evidences, right? Well, given the resurrection hypothesis is true, yes, we would have an empty tomb. We would have the appearance to Paul, the appearance of the 12, the appearance of the 500. So these are all 100%, and that's what I factor in here. On the alternative side, the conditional probabilities, I gave differing values just for the sake of argument. Okay, what's the probability that we'd have the empty tomb? I said, well, that's also 100%. Maybe someone stole the body. That's an equally probable explanation. Technically speaking, it is the same for the appearance to the Paul and the appearance to 500. These should be 100% as well, but I mixed it up for the sake of illustration. And the appearance to the 12, well, okay, what is the probability that we'd have the appearance of the 12 given the resurrection hypothesis is false? Said 5%. These are all made up numbers just to illustrate, and you can see how that calculation comes up. Okay, it would arrive at, wish there's a way to move this stupid share screen button, but anyways, you can see it comes out to 97%, right? If you plug in all these numbers, that's what you get. Okay? This is using the proper Bayesian approach. Using my Bayes-ish resurrection hypothesis with the direct probabilities, it's actually more conservative, more skeptical. It produces lower results consistently. So again, assuming the prior probability is 50%, just like we did above. And then for each of the evidential factors, empty tomb, I assign, well, that proves, let's say 55% that the resurrection hypothesis is true. Appearance to Paul, that's 70%. Appearance to the 12, 80%. And I also threw in this little trick here because this is relevant to one of David's objections later where he's misunderstanding. So let's say the appearance of the 500. Pretend I'm only convinced that 30% proves the resurrection hypothesis is true, right? So I'm plugging in the formula. Okay, we got 55 for the empty tomb, 70% for the appearance to Paul, 80% for the appearance of the 12, and then, oops, where's that 30%? Why am I not putting the 30% in here? And it's because I'm not doing what David thinks I'm doing. I'm not asking this, what's the probability that we have evidence for the resurrection or proof that the resurrection is true? No, the hypothesis is, what's the probability that the resurrection is true given the evidence? The evidence is supporting that hypothesis. It's not a part of the hypothesis itself. So in Bayes' theorem, if I were to plug 30% in here, that would artificially lower the overall probability. I would not arrive at 92%. And this is why anything that is a non-relevant evidence that's 50% or less, I ignore from the calculation because they're not relevant. Think about it. The appearance of the 500, I can only prove that the resurrection happened is true on that evidence given 30%. Well, my lack of ability to prove the resurrection is true on the basis of the appearance of the 500 doesn't necessarily entail that the resurrection hypothesis is false, right? It just means we can't use this evidence to prove on a balance of probabilities that the hypothesis is true. So therefore, it should be ignored. If I plugged it in, that's like saying, well, actually, there's 70% proof that the resurrection hypothesis is false, given my inability to prove that it's true from the appearance of the 500. No, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence unless you can prove we would have an expectation. And in my case here, I'm saying we have no expectation of the ability to prove the appearance of the 500 proves that the resurrection hypothesis is true. Does that make sense, or was that, because I know that sounded a little bit confusing, but
Let
are you
me
getting this?
let me ask
Go ahead.
Andrew to pull up a chair. Or I'm sorry, Mr. iPhone, if that's his real name. And uh, because I know that he is familiar with Bayes and all of that, and so the only, does this is what Dale saying here, does that make sense from a probabilistic mathematical standpoint? Because I don't know.
Okay, so here's what I see. Dale may well clear some of this up later on. But given the 50-50 bit of this, Dell has done that absolutely correctly. Now, you could start with some other mathematical value, right? You could start at 0, right? As long as both sides, as long as we're talking about some sort of naive Bayes calculation here, you starting at 50-50 is fine, because what you're doing is just saying from the beginning, I don't know the outcome. You could use 3 and 3, or 1 and 1, or 50 and 50. It doesn't matter, as long as when you start with naive Bayes, you're starting with a balanced probability. Dale's dead right there. But I think what we're discovering, and what you have said, and what Brian has said, is the thing that I want to reiterate. So Bayes works best when the hypothesis that you are dealing with is very, very finely tuned. And your objection was, well, look, sure, it could be the Christian God. It could be any being with sufficient ability to raise someone from the dead. Here's something that hasn't been talked about, but isn't impossible. Some sort of natural causes, right? And so here is my point. Given the background probabilities that we are talking about here, for my taste, Bayes is not a good way to approach this problem, because we are elevating background belief to background knowledge. And I think that's the fundamental mistake that I see here, is a conflation of belief and knowledge. But as far as the math goes, Dale has done a good job here. Now, I'm on record not being a big fan of Dale's Bayes-like math. I haven't changed my view there, but Dale has done a good job of describing Bayes, of describing the conditional probabilities, of talking about where counter arguments would fit in to the Bayes formula. He's done a good job there.
Okay.
I think the problem actually lies in the foundational assumptions. Now, Brian and Darren may well have different thoughts, and I'll shut up and you can ask them what they
Actually,
think.
what I'm going to say is, I know that Brian might be in and out. I know that you have some obligations that usually show up on the weekends, and so when and Darren is probably like me. We're just in our podcast pants here because we got nothing better to do today.
I have two things to say to Andrew. If that's
let me. I'm gonna let you get there. The thing I wanted to finish saying was, when one of you guys have to go, and you know that you have to go, just kind of find a good, clean place to come in and make your remark or ask your question or comment, because I do want to leave it available to you, because some of the more open discussion is going to come later, and I am trying to bias this front end to giving Dale his full opportunity to make his presentation. Go ahead, Dale.
Okay. So should I speed up a bit, or I don't know how long, because I just see the slide, so I don't know.
No. You go ahead.
Okay.
If you feel like you have to speed up or rush or cut some things out, it will seem, and in fact, it will be unfair. And when I look in my mirror every morning, I want it to tell me that I am the fairest of them all.
Okay. All right. Cool. So
That was really
okay,
funny, folks. I mean, there should have been some polite laughter there.
See, the problem, I can't see your faces, so I don't know if you're smiling. I don't know my cues.
They're not smiling. They're dicks. Screw them all. Go ahead, Dale.
Okay, cool.
It was hilarious, and you know it.
So I am, in a sense, I'm really glad to hear Andrew say that he agreed with me, because to my mind, this is a change. When I was on his show, 4A, it sounded to me like he was pretty insistent. No, it's got to be 0, 0. So now from my understanding, you have changed there. There is just one thing I want to disagree with you on, because again, the prior probability, I'm just assuming it's 50% for illustration purposes. I have a slide coming up where we look at the prior probability and debate that a bit more, differences. But one thing Andrew said that's wrong is he said, well, as long as you put 3% here and then 3% here, as long as whatever percent you put is the same, it's not going to affect the calculation. That's not true at all. If I put 3% here or 3% down here, that is grossly going to affect the calculation. And
hold on, not quite what I said. Let me just clear this up.
Sure.
I was talking about the starting probability. So with naive Bayes, you start off at it's 50% true or false, in essence.
Okay.
And you could start with some other naive number. You shouldn't, because it would just be very strange. But you could start with 0, 0. And if one probability turned out to be greater than the other, one turns out to be 6% likely, and the other turns out to be 5% likely. As long as you started with a balanced number on each side of the equation, the math would still work perfectly fine. We start with 50-50 because we tend to think in terms of percentages. But if we used hexadecimal, for instance, and we started with 8 and 8, we'd come out with some hexadecimal value. But as long as the beginning probability was balanced, it would still be a naive Bayesian outcome.
Now, okay, just so I'm understanding those, so you're saying this whole factor is like 3% and or something like that, because the only thing, if you want to, you have to start at 50%. If you're giving a naive thing that's 3% or whatever, you're kind of baking in the evidence or background knowledge or something going in there to be, because if I did that, like let's say I plugged in 0% for this, what you're going to get is 0% basically, because 0%,
right, which is why I didn't start with 0, because multiplying or dividing by 0 turns out to either be 0 in the case of multiplication, or undefined if you're dividing by 0.
Okay, I'll come back to that thing, because I'm not sure if we're totally agreeing or not. So, all right, cool. I might be misunderstanding what you're saying.
You are, but let me leave it with this. Starting with a balanced probability is the right place to start. So you start with you start with some balanced probability like 50-50. And you could use any numbers in place of 50-50 as long as it was balanced, and you recognized that the outcome, if one was greater than the other, the greater of the two would be most likely. But 50-50 is what we do with Bayes. And it's also the way we think, which is why we use 50-50. It's a coin toss, right? The outcome before the analysis is equal.
Okay, because you do this factor here. This is supposed to be 1 minus whatever the numerator is. So if your numerator was 3%, this would have to be 97%. So that's the only.
Again,
I did misunderstand. Okay, cool. Fine. We'll get to that in a bit. But here's the question that I wanted to get. That's key to this slide. So this is talking about not the prior probabilities, but this specific aspect here. Do you think I'm right as to why I'm excluding? I'm not multiplying by 30% because look, the 30% is just saying this is how David understands. Like I've only got 30% probability that I can prove the resurrection hypothesis is true, given the appearance to the 500. Again, this is just a made up number, but it's below 50%. And so I just ignore that because my inability to prove the resurrection hypothesis on the basis of the appearance to the 500, just because that evidence happens to be weak, we don't have multiple sources or something, that does not entail the falsity of the hypothesis, right? Unless you can prove that somehow what we would expect to have better evidence for the appearance of the 500. So does that part at least make sense as to why I'm excluding the 30% from this calculation here? Oops, I stumped them.
Well, Tyler,
Yes.
you can turn on your video if you want, but at this point, you'd be the only one trying to give Dale's slide the priority, and you, sir, are a good-looking man. You would be a distraction.
Did that make sense? Did you guys hear what I just said? Or?
I did, and look, so my comments are not very useful at this stage, I think.
Gotcha.
I mean, it sounds like, you're looking at a list of things that you initially put in there as evidence, and you're saying, well, this evidence, if I included that, that would actually hurt my theory, so I'll throw it out, which is fine. I guess you have the right to do that, and you can put in any number of evidences or throw out whatever harms your theory that you want. But then I don't know what the point is of the equation in the first place then. If you're just going to throw out all the stuff that hurts your argument and keep all the stuff that helps it, you don't need a Bayesian analysis for that.
So there's my point then, David. It doesn't hurt the hypothesis, and that's why we're throwing it out. It's the equivalent of saying, like, look, we don't have absolute empirical proof that, pick an eternal cosmological model or a model for how abiogenesis. We can't prove right now on a balance of probabilities which specific hypothesis is true. So let's say we've got 20% proof that a given the RNA world hypothesis is true or something, right? The evidence doesn't warrant it. I wouldn't hold that against the theory of abiogenesis just because we can't prove it. That doesn't entail that abiogenesis is false because we don't have good evidence for the RNA world hypothesis. And that's exactly what I'm saying here with the appearance of the 500. My simple inability to prove that the resurrection is true from the appearance of the 500 doesn't entail that, well, then the resurrection didn't happen. It's false. Does that make sense?
I suppose so. And I can. So I'm trying to connect this to my 50/50 objection and just kind of understand the Bayes a little bit better. I'm not going to become a Bayes competent person on this podcast, so I can tell you that right now. But if you start at 50%, let's just take a very simple example. You do all your calculations and you end up at 60%. And so great. That means that in real numbers, it's 10% more likely that God exists than not.
No. See, that's where you're misunderstanding. See that what you're assessing like this, and what I'm going to be explaining when I go to your objection, you're misunderstanding how Bayes' theorem works. It's almost like this isn't the right way to say it, but this will help you to understand. It's assessing almost two hypotheses, right? So 51 to 100%, that means it's more probable than not that the hypothesis is true.
Right.
Okay? So that's one level.
But how much more matters, right?
Sorry?
How much more? Yeah, how much more likely it's true than not matters. And in the example I gave, it's only 10% more likely true than not.
It's only 10% more. No, there is no. 10% plus 50. That's not what we're doing. It's either 60%. The evidence itself is 60. It proves the hypothesis is true with a 60% degree sufficiency. If I only had a 10% degree of sufficiency, I would ignore that evidence. I wouldn't go, well, 10 plus 50 equals 60%, so therefore it gets included. That's the wrong way to do it, because this should be, I would go 30 plus 50 then if that was the case, right? So
Okay.
that's what I'm trying to
I'm
clarify.
not going to dispute I'm not a Bayes guy, so I will just take your word. I'll take Andrew's word, and I would just say then with that calculation, 60% doesn't mean the same to me
Can I
as it
say
does
something?
to you.
Can I say something real quick that might help clarify things?
Sure.
Yeah.
When you start with 50-50 like that, you're not talking about the real world. You're talking about what you believe. So it's a unit measurement thing. So starting with 50-50, he'll never be able to prove that something in reality actually happened. All he can do is prove that he believes that something in reality happened, and that he has more reason to believe it than not. That's basically what you're doing when you start with 50-50 like that.
Okay, well, I'll answer that in a bit. But again, this has nothing regardless of what this is, 50-50 doesn't matter to the point that I'm making here. This is only about this factor. And I'm just trying to say I'm excluding anything that's 50% or less does not prove that the hypothesis is probably true. The way Bayes understand it, if you have 49% to 0%, that is a separate, Bayes understands that as a separate hypothesis. You are claiming positively it is not the true. The hypothesis that Jesus rose from the dead is not true, and we can prove it to whatever degree, kind of thing. That's the way Bayes understand it. And I have some uh, proof here.
Mm. You don't have to spend that much time on it right now. I know that we'll get there further, and I acknowledge to you and the audience, I am wrong. I understand that. I'm just trying to wrap my mind around the language of Bayes to then properly express my objection. So I don't
Yeah,
know how to
I'm
do
trying
that
my
right
best.
now.
No problem. Well, hopefully, okay. I'm trying my best. Hopefully,
Yeah.
it'll come.
And I'm trying my best too. Like I didn't go that. I never took calculus, so it's just a whole different language to me and a different way of wrapping my head around this
It's,
stuff. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and like I said, I'm the same way. That's why I'm using my Bayes-ish approach. I'm doing it. I'm using it differently, or I'm using it not properly, as Tim McGrew says. So okay, cool. So here's another example, right? So when I'm assessing the probability, so in this case, I picked God exists just for the sake of argument. Again, let's assume the prior probability is 50%. I'm just saying that because that the main point here is we're looking at this factor. What's the probability that it's true God exists given the evidence that we have? Now, remember, when I assess these, I assess positive evidences like the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, or the moral argument, but there are also negative evidences that have to be factored in, right? So things like the problem of evil and the hiddenness of God. And I've again, these numbers are all made up and just for illustration purposes. But look, here I've said that the problem of evil, I'm 70% sure that God does not exist. So and on the hiddenness of God, I'm 95% certain God does not exist. So in this case, these factors need to go into the equation, right? But here, our hypothesis is stated in positive terms. The hypothesis is that God does exist. So in order to convert that, it's simple. You just go, well, if there's a 70% chance, given the problem of evil, that God doesn't exist, that means there's a 30% chance that our hypothesis is true. 100 minus 70%. So in this case, this is where I would plug 30% into the equation because this is relevant evidence that disproves the hypothesis or means that it's improbable to be true. Same with the hiddenness of God, 100% minus 95%. So did someone say something? no, is okay. 100 minus 95 is 5%. That goes into the equation because this time it's relevant, even though it's less than 50%, whatever. But because in this case, we're saying, yes, we can establish with a 70% degree, or in this case, a 95% degree, we would expect to have evidence that we lack. Or in this case, we would expect not to have the evidence of evil, but guess what? There is evil. So this counts against. And the point I'm trying to get here, right? Again, the prior probability is irrelevant to what I'm saying here. So I'm just assuming 50% here. But look, when you plug that in, I have my positive features. This increases the overall probability. But because these are less than 50%, this decreases it back down. And you get 53.85 given all 5 of these factors, including the 2 factors that are less than 50%. So it's, David, the way you were thinking about the 30% up there is, well, if I have 65.9 and then 0.7 and then 75%, and I add to it 30% and 5%, it should be going up even more. This should be like 99% proven. But that's not the way Bayes understand. When you put a figure that's less than 50%, it lowers the overall probability. And that's why I only get 53.85. And that's why I ignore any and all irrelevant probabilities less of 50% or less if they're irrelevant. In this case, they're provably relevant because they falsify the hypothesis that God exists.
I get that part.
Okay, cool.
I take a little bit of offense though, because I had 1,000 T-shirts made that said 53.14, and now
These are made
just
up
all
numbers. So.
it's all junked now. I gotta go back and do 53.85. I'm not very happy about that. Go ahead.
All right, cool. So okay, cool. So I'm glad that makes sense. Great. Okay, now we get to the prior probability issue. And here's right. So in this case, the default has to be 50-50. It can't be 3% and 3%, because this, number one, the formula is 1 minus whatever the numerator is. So if I assign 3% to the prior probability, then this would have to be 97%. The opposite factor is 97%. So the only times you can get it equal is if it's 50%, because 100 minus 50 equals 50. So this is non-negotiable for the default prior probability factor, right? If you have zero evidence that God exists and zero evidence that God does not exist, in Bayes' theorem, that is 50%. If you were to plug in 0%, I'll just go to, this is when I did my show with Andrew, I proved that that's not the case, right? So if you were to plug in 0%, so here I did it for the resurrection, and I did just the evidence, forget the prior probability, I factored in these evidences, and I got 77.78%, okay? So no prior probability is in this equation. It's just the evidence. And I get 77.78%. Now, if it's true, if we can just plug in, we don't have to plug in 50%. If we plug in 0, 0 or 1 and 1 or whatever it is, you're going to get a different value. Now, obviously, I plugged in 0% here because that's what me and Andrew discussed on a show years ago. But if you plug in 0%, that shouldn't happen. If you interpret 0% as like, oh well, we just have 0% evidence as the starting point, then when I plug it into Bayes, I shouldn't arrive at 0%. I should arrive at 77.78, the same place I was before I even looked at the prior probability. But that's not true, right? So the only thing that leaves unaffected is when you plug in 50% as the prior probability, and look, 77.78%. That means only the 50% has no impact on your mathematical calculations one way or the other, which is what it's supposed to be, right? If you have 0% evidence that God exists, then your calculations shouldn't change because you're adding nothing to it.
I kind of get that, but just a clarification on prior probability.
Yeah.
So you don't start your probability at 50-50 blindly. You have things that go into your prior probability that get it to 50%. Is that correct?
Yeah. You could bring up evidence, right, on either side. For example, Richard Swinburne brings up evidence. He thinks the prior probability is like 97%. So he argues for that. He has the burden of proof to prove that on the background knowledge, it's 97%. On the opposite end, if an atheist says, no, 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 the prior probability that God exists or the resurrection is like 3%, then you have to prove that. You have the burden of proof to prove that it's that lower value.
Right, but you said that you put it at 50% with regard to your prior probability. So you actually did math that came up with 50%, or are you just using that as a heuristic to say, well, we don't know anything, and so we're all equal?
So what I did is, so number one, that's the default. But then I was confronted with evidences and arguments on either way, saying no, it should be higher, no, it should be lower. And after considering all of those things, I think they can all be defeated. I don't think that they are persuasive on a balance of probabilities, or on a balance of improbabilities on the other end, and stuff. And so, yeah, I stayed at the 50-50 because none of the factors arguing for a higher prior probability were persuasive to me. On the other hand, none of the prior probability factors arguing that it should be lower were persuasive to me. So I remained at 50-50.
So you evaluated it and you believe they canceled out.
Yes,
But if I
exactly.
evaluate the same factors that you did, I am going to most certainly come up with a different starting point. And so it would not, in fact, be accurate for me to say, well, let's start at 50-50. So you're not just starting there because it's easy. You're starting there because you're saying you did the calculation to get there. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah, I
Okay.
considered the arguments.
Then I
And
retract my 50-50 objection, and I replace it with the we have to actually look at the prior probabilities that we're dealing with, and come up with better numbers objection. So
Hey, David,
uh
just for the audience, what Dale thinks he proved in our conversations was an Ask an Atheist Anything episode, and they're welcome to go back and listen to that and see if Dale proved his case. He has mentioned that show a time or two now, and so folks can find it. It's an Ask an Atheist
shoot me a
Anything.
link and I'll put it in the I'll put it in the show. All right.
Yeah, that
So
was a good show. I think it was relevant.
So Dale,
It was a good show. I
grant
appreciated you coming.
I grant the whole 50-50 thing. So you've taken that objection off the board. You simply replaced it with a better one.
Okay, cool. Awesome. No, that's great. That's programming. That makes me happy. So, okay. And here, all I'm doing is proving, look, okay, so pretend we don't plug in 50-50. This is made up numbers, but let's say I am convinced, right? David, you said it would not be 50. I presume it's going to be less than 50 for you.
Yeah,
Let's say
let's say 2080.
Sorry, 2080. Okay. So I put 30% here, right?
Okay, 3070,
So
great.
look, if you put in, again, making that point, if you put in 30% as the prior probability, all the other numbers are the same, that lowers the thing, and you get 33% overall. Same deal on the other end, though. If you have reason to think the prior probability is greater than 50%, I plugged in 60. Look at that, you get 62.63%. So this is just showing how the numbers affect, but it sounds like you've got that point. So
no, I do, and the clarification that really makes the difference for me, and the reason I'm willing to give up that point so readily is because you are saying that you did the math. I don't even need to know the math. You did the calculation, your emotional numbers, and you came up honestly with 50%. It wasn't a lazy, let's just start at 50% because, it
do you
sounds
agree,
good.
though, prior to doing the work, though, would you agree the default, pretend you were not privy to any of the arguments on either side for the background knowledge, the default is the 50-50 in Bayes' theorem. That's where you got to start. If you don't have any arguments either side, because that's going to be relevant to your lottery example later.
Yeah, I think we get sidetracked with that question because that's not what you did, and that's not what I'm doing. So we come up with our numbers honestly. But that said,
David, can I jump in here for one quick second?
yeah.
I just wanted to affirm what Dale's saying. If you truly are completely 100% naive, and this is the critical part, and it's an actual true dichotomy that you're evaluating, then the starting point default is 50-50.
Yeah,
I can also be truly naive about whether person A, B, or C is going to win a race. But my default percentages then should be 33%, 33%, 33%. So it's critical that what you're creating is an actual true dichotomy before getting to a proper default of 50-50.
Yeah, I agree
That's
with
a
all
great
that,
point.
and I think that's a fair
That's right.
clarification. So,
Yeah, that is a great point. And all my calculations are a simple binary choice, right? Either the hypothesis is true or the hypothesis is false. So that's why for me fit. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Like in probability theory, if you had like three equally probable options, then yeah, the probability that any one of those would be selected randomly is 33%, 33%, 33% kind of thing. So you would do it that way. But yeah, with my numbers, it's all simple. I'm trying to do this for the reasonable real seeker. It's just
I
look, my
understand that, but
hypothesis
we're
is
not
true or it's
eliminating
false.
background knowledge here. So we're not assuming that no one
Right.
has any background knowledge.
Yeah.
And in the real world, we have background knowledge for all kinds of stuff, background beliefs for all kinds of stuff. And so that's why the background knowledge numbers have to be honest to start on the right percentage. Because if you don't, then as you illustrate it, you'll end up with, possibly wildly too high numbers or wildly too low numbers. And so you have to do the background knowledge work before you start doing the other work.
Agreed. Okay, so this is great. So for all these years when you guys were rejecting my 50-50, it's because you thought I just had the default and I refused to even look at the background knowledge and
That's what I
consider
thought. So
that. Okay.
I'm-
It
Okay.
wasn't what I thought, by the way, but I still reject it.
Okay. Okay, cool. So we can still deal with that objection then. So that's the end of my opening speech, and I've got my slides for David's objections. So what do you want me to do at this point, David? Like, do you want to?
let's have Darren give his objection since he's the last man standing on that particular objection.
Okay. So go to the 50-50. Okay, so this one right here, number 2.
Well, my objection isn't necessarily that the math doesn't work out. My objection is that the math doesn't say what you think it says when you start with 50-50, because in order to start with 50-50, you have to literally have no background knowledge. And if you have no background knowledge, you have no right to say that something has a 50% chance. Because at that point, you're making a statement of ignorance, not a statement of something you know. And it's a GIGO problem.
Well, what if in my case, right? So what David's learning is that I'm not in a state of ignorance. I've considered the background arguments and stuff like that to the best of my ability, and I found them all wanting. And so in that case, I am still left at the 50-50 thing.
Right, but then you've got actual background knowledge that you've come to the conclusion that 50-50 is a correct percentage. It isn't that just assuming 50-50 isn't right, because it's something that's like, for example, logically impossible. It does not have a 50% chance of existing or not existing.
Right.
You may be in a state of ignorance, so you don't know if it is even possible, and you can claim that's 50-50, but at that point, that 50-50 is a state of ignorance, not a state of knowing something. If you've already done the background knowledge and you say it's 50-50, then you're making a statement of knowledge that, or at least a statement of belief that you think that is 50% likely.
Yeah, so I think I look, I agree that when I'm assessing the prior probabilities, these are also subjective probabilities that I'm assigning, and I'm also a human being, right? So there may be some background evidence that I haven't even come across yet. So yeah, maybe it's because of ignorance. If I had only considered J.L. Schellenberg's argument against libertarian free will. I saw Tyler Vela is in the audience, so I'm sure he'll like that. Right? He says it's impossible for God to exist because libertarian free will exists. So that rules out God. That's logically inconsistent in his mind in some way, right? So,
Excuse me, Andrew. Andrew, can I get you to mute your phone?
Remember who Beth went to?
Well,
okay.
Yes, apologies. I thought I was on mute.
No.
Thanks.
So that's always going to be the case, right? So again, my probabilities are on me as a reasonable real seeker doing my best to assess all the arguments that I come across. And even though that's a fallible standard, that's where premise 9 of my argument comes in. We have God preventing undue confusion. And look, I'm not responsible to know what I don't know. I'm just responsible as a reasonable real seeker to do my best. Oh, sorry.
Right, but I get all that. But my objection is that if you're defaulting to 50-50 just because you have no background knowledge, you're not starting from a realistic starting point. Like David said, you have to do some work to get your priors before you can even get started, because starting at 50-50, if you don't have any background knowledge, it's just a statement of ignorance. It's not a statement of reality. And if you're trying to prove something in reality, you have to start from a place of knowledge, not a place of ignorance.
And
that was my early objection in the show that we had over on Asking Atheists Anything.
But since that's not what Dale is doing, we're just arguing about how Bayes works at that point. No one cares. So
actually, David, sorry, before you jump forward, it's you're robbing Peter to pay Paul with this way of doing things, because they are absolutely correct that if you're coming at 50-50 naively, then it's definitionally a state of ignorance. However, if you come to 50-50 after all this analysis, like Dale has done, you also have to acknowledge that Dale's methods are not 100% precise. You have to affix error bars to where you get to. So Dale may actually land at 50-50, but I promise you he's not at 50-50 plus or minus 0.001%.
Right.
We have to acknowledge the bluntness and inaccuracy of the methods used, and you have to put wide error bars on that.
But
50%.
that's kind of where I want to go next, because we're not arguing about actually whether, if you are in a vacuum and you know nothing, then where the good starting point is. I mean, that's a fine debate. As I understand it, you just can't use Bayes at that point, because you need to have some background knowledge to plug in good numbers. But that's not where Dale is. And I take Dale at his word that he did the work to get to 50-50. And so what I want to go to next is where I think everyone is kind of jumping at the bit, and it's not even necessarily one of the objections. I guess it is one of the objections. It's what is the background knowledge, and how did you come up with those numbers, and how do you suggest others come up with these numbers? I personally believe that Bayes' theorem is a terrible way to decide the types of things that you're talking about. Did the resurrection happen? Did it not? Because you're talking about things that inherently have no numerical value. You just have to assign them out of something. So what are you using to assign numbers to that, and give us a way to evaluate that so that we can at least understand how you came to your numbers, and if we wanted to use this method, how we should use it to come to our numbers.
So look, this is just an issue. This isn't even an issue about Bayes' theorem or anything. It's just kind of the use of subjective probabilities. And David Kemble Cook, our mutual friend, he sent me an email the other day. He wants to do a show. He gave a list of there's 9 types of probabilities out there. I didn't know there was that many. I knew there was 4 major categories or something, right? But subjective probabilities are valid. They are recognized.
So what I'm asking you to do is to make a case for your subjective probabilities, because this is a show to help people understand how you got to where you're going, and someone else might want to use that method, plugging in their own numbers to see where they get. I would find it an interesting experiment to do it if I could wrap my head around the math, to find a way to plug in some numbers that make sense to me and see what it comes up with. But we don't understand that unless you explain where your numbers come from and how you suggest we get ours, because otherwise you can say it's Bayes or Bayesish or math, but it's none of that if the numbers don't make sense.
Okay, so you're wanting to know what were the factors I considered at arriving at. You're not objecting to my assessment, like the number that I assigned. You're just wanting me to
Well,
lay
yeah,
out,
I
well, how
mean,
did I get
we
there?
can get to the numbers that you assign, but it's important to know, because this is math. How did you assign that number? So, if you assigned
Well, it's the same thing.
55% to, the testimony of the apostles, say, um,
Mhm.
great. I wouldn't, and I don't know, maybe you assigned 70%, whatever it is. What factors did you look at? What numbers did you assign them? And how did you get there? And that way I can get a roadmap for seeing if this method of yours is portable and can be used by other people and for other things.
Yeah, so in terms of subjective probabilities, obviously, you're kind of conflating the evidence and the background evidence a bit. So
Yes.
those
I,
are different, right? But
I
it's the
acknowledge that I
same.
don't understand the difference in why one thing would be considered background knowledge and another thing would just be, separate evidence. I don't understand that. But that's honestly, that's not the most interesting part of my ignorance. So it's really
Okay, well,
this.
just to clarify, then I guess because this is about how base works, right? So when you're looking at
Well,
the
no, it's about
first,
how your base works.
gotcha, right? So
Look, Dale's
regardless,
right, David. This is just about um, where you place a particular bit of evidence in the Bayes formula. So, I mean, we are talking about Dale and Bayes, but whether something is a prior or evidence is just about when it happened in the timeline of the thing that you're assessing, and that will determine uh, where it falls in the calculations of the formula.
Right. So I'm just asking. I'm asking for more of a breakdown so that we can see the
so let
work.
me okay, cool. So let me give. So here's an example of evidence that. So if a given piece of evidence speaks directly to the truth or falsity of the hypothesis under evaluation. So you're talking about the resurrection, right? That's the main example we've been using, kind of thing.
Well, that's the thing that
So,
your formula was made to prove, right?
well, again, that was just the example, but it works for whatever the Bayes theorem works for whatever hypothesis you want to plug in, right? So it just if I want to plug in the hypothesis Christianity is true or the hypothesis Muhammad flew to thing, it's all the same thing. And it's just certain evidence will be relevant to that hypothesis.
Okay.
Like the appearance of the 12 isn't relevant to the hypothesis Muhammad flew to Jerusalem on a
Right. But
winged.
let's try to stick to the your actual thesis, the thing that you proved and how you proved it, so that we don't have to speak hypothetically. You
Okay.
tell us what you did. Show us your work.
Okay, so my hypothesis in Bayes, if we look at where did I use Bayes? I used it particularly for premise one. So the hypothesis there would be God exists. Also premise 11, which is a little bit nuanced. It isn't the resurrection, or it isn't that Christianity is true even. It's the probability that Christianity has religion authenticating events. That's my hypothesis, if you want to be technical, kind of thing, right? So that's where there was four positive evidential, subjective probability things that factored in as evidence directly supporting that. The
Okay.
historical evidence from the resurrection, the shroud.
So it's not about the resurrection per se. It's about proving that Christianity is true.
No. So my argument's more nuanced, right? It's about Christianity has religion authenticating events.
Okay. Christianity has religion authenticating events. And the resurrection is
That,
just one of those things. Is that correct?
right. That's one
Okay.
of the evidences that proves that. So this is
Okay.
premise 11 of my argument that
Sure.
that is true.
All right. Go ahead.
Okay. So those would be evidences that speak directly to it. Background evidence is, I mean, you've witnessed tons of, me and Darren and everyone on here, we've gone through lots of debates on SNS, right? So obviously my prior premises would need to be true, right? If in order to say that yes, we have evidence that it's true that Christianity has religion authenticating events, well, that presupposes God exists. If God, if the background knowledge or evidence suggests God doesn't exist, if all the evidence rules out God is a real maximally great being, well, then that would make it extremely low to whatever degree I'm confident that we can prove such a God doesn't exist. Likewise, if premise 2 doesn't work, or premise 3, say God didn't provide divine revelation. All of these things would be kind of relevant background evidence. They don't speak directly to the truth or falsity of the hypothesis, but they are indirectly relevant because, yeah, there's no religion authenticating miracles if there's no God to do them.
Okay, so I think I got confused by your use of evidence, and so again, this may just be a Bayes thing, and I don't know Bayes. You haven't said anything that would qualify as evidence to me. These are just theories. These are beliefs, if you will. Is that proper to use that interchangeably with evidence, background evidence?
Well, no. So it is evidence, right? Because the formation of the shroud images is evidence that directly supports the truth of the hypothesis about the religion authenticating stuff. But you're right that, okay, well, that's all I've done on this show. That's just an assertion. So obviously you need to get into it. Well, is that true? What is the evidence for the evidence, I guess, so to speak? Like how do we know that the image formation does
Right.
prove?
I accept the shroud as background evidence. I don't accept God exists as background evidence, though, because that's not quite of the same character and nature.
Well, the shroud is direct. It's evidence. It's
Yes, I accept the
supporting.
shroud as evidence.
It's not background evidence. It's evidence
Oh,
for it,
okay.
right?
Then I accept it as evidence. Then I don't
And
know the
and
difference
wait,
between
and
background and evidence. But what I'm saying
let
is,
me
God exists is not of the same nature. Is it? Because we have a shroud.
No,
We
I
don't.
mean,
God exists. God exists as background, but I think
It's
someone was
background.
trying to get in.
Okay.
So
Go ahead.
God exists as premise 1 of Dale's argument. So isn't it the first Bayesian factor? It's not background evidence. It's one of the first things you got to analyze in a Bayesian nature down the chain of probability.
so it's background evidence with respect to the truth of premise 11. If I'm using Bayes' theorem to prove premise 11, where the hypothesis is Christianity has religion authenticating events, that would be relevant background knowledge. Now, when I'm assessing premise 1, where the hypothesis is God exists, then yeah, the cosmological argument would be direct evidences for that hypothesis. So it just depends what is the hypothesis kind
So
of thing,
once
right?
again, I'm sure that this is my confusion, but I would think that if you're going to use something like God exists as background knowledge, what you would actually want to say is uh, millions of people throughout the existence of people have said and believed and cataloged for themselves the existence of God. That I would say, okay, that could go in there as evidence, but you're not saying that. You're saying God exists.
Yeah,
And
because
so the claim, it
uh,
seems like it seems like we're skipping a step. You could easily say the testimony of millions of people is part of the background evidence, and I wouldn't have an objection with that. Where am I wrong?
so you're wrong because you're denying that the end of the conclusion um, can be used of an argument can be used of as evidence for another conclusion, right? So what you're catching on to is that well, obviously, look, if I'm saying the Shroud of Turin or the historical evidence for the resurrection counts as evidence for my premise 11 hypothesis, you're pointing out, but yeah, like I don't believe that those are established evidence. Like, how are you doing that? And obviously, I've got sub arguments or sub reasons where I would appeal to even further evidence, such as the testimony from the Gospels, or in the Shroud's case, the scientific study. So there are multiple levels of evidence.
Right, but you're calling the existence of God background knowledge. And so the thing we know is that people claim that there's a God. We know that there is, documentation of people believing in and worshiping a God. These are things that I have no problem considering background knowledge. But look, I accept that you're right and I'm wrong again, because I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
David, David, let me jump in for a second.
Sure.
Part of the issue here is background knowledge is a term of art related to using Bayes. Dale has already admitted that he's not using straight Bayes. He's using a Bayes-ish approach. So it's becoming murky. What's background knowledge versus these claims that are being evaluated in the formula. So I think that's unfortunately an issue with the method he's using, and it causes these equivocations and talking past each other.
So I don't want to get tied up in that, because I'm happy to just not call it Bayes and just call it Dalian probability. That's still a valid theory as far as I'm concerned. I'm just trying to figure out how it works. And so if you can use the conclusion of God exists in Dalian probability math, okay, I will wrap my mind around that. But I don't want to derail on things that Dale says are not important. I take his word for it. I want to see how the work is done, and so it doesn't matter if it's a pure form of some other math to me.
Okay, so again, we're not doing the debate, but this is how it would work, right? So if I said premise 11, if my argument is true, how the Christianity has religion authenticating events. That's my main hypothesis that I want to prove with using Bayes, right? Then you say, oh well, how do you know? And I list off the 4 things, like the Shroud of Turin or something like that.
Sure.
And then you say, well, you evaluated the Shroud of Turin. How do you know? And I say, well, part of it, the background knowledge in my concluding that is that God exists as a fact.
Okay.
That's part of the background knowledge that played a role in my prior probability in assessing this.
Right.
Then you can take it back and go, okay, well, how do you know God exists? And then I can point to further evidence that I derived that conclusion from, such as the cosmological argument, the teleological
and we're going to do this next month. So I don't mean to get derailed on that. I just didn't realize the degree to which God exists was baked in the beginning of this formula.
Well, and remember that it's a percentage. So my background knowledge for God existing would be 0. Dale's would be, 60% or 70% or something like that. So that's
right. But maybe he's justified.
It's not like,
and maybe he's justified in that number. This isn't the show for him to justify that number. I just didn't realize that you could plug in God exists as background knowledge. And as Dale explains it, I'm willing to accept his explanation.
Well, that's what I'm saying is the background knowledge is a percentage. So it's not like he's saying it's 100% that God exists. There's a percentage that God exists. So for me, plugging in that background knowledge would be 0 for God exists.
Hey, Dale, what is your number for God exists, as Darren is trying to explain it?
So today it's changed. At the time of my conversion, it was between 99 to 99.99%.
Okay.
Today, due to a properly basic belief, and I think that's the only type of evidence that can get you to 100%. But I do have 100%.
Okay. I'm not going to question that number. Just understand that if I am following along and plugging in my numbers based on my research and my efforts, it's going to be different from yours. And, I can't say you're wrong and you can't say I'm wrong.
Hey, Dave, if you don't mind me just saying something here that may help all the people sort of listening. Bayes is more properly used in a place where the starting factors are more easily agreed. Bayes is great in scientific exploration. It's not great when the beginnings of the conversation are all subjective. That's the problem here. Is that if we were using Bayes to assess, I think Dale used at the beginning. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dale, but you used an example having to do with sickness. Is that what you used at the beginning?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really common, right? If you want to study Bayes, you see that example over and over and over. Well, Bayes is really good at that kind of thing because we can assess sickness with a higher degree of objectivity than we can this entire conversation. So when we start talking about prior probability and background knowledge and evidence and all of that sort of thing, what we are doing at the end is still arguing over the subjective nature of belief. No matter how finely we carve Bayes and how finely we tune the premises of these arguments, we are still arguing highly subjectively. And of course, the problem then is that the error in subjectivity is likely to be much greater than any number that we achieve at the end of running through a Bayesian process.
Yeah, see, so that's totally right, right? So here's a couple things. So remember, Brian was asking me the other day, I think it was on the show with Tyler, about, I mentioned the agnostic range, right? So for me, this is an arbitrarily chosen thing, but when I first started using Bayes, I assigned always for objective evidences that were reasoned and stuff like that. I would always assign plus or minus 5%. That was just my standard deviation and that sort of thing, right? So therefore, I believed in this agnostic range where it would be rationally permissible to, even if I'm 53.14%, which is what I got, there's your t-shirt, David, it would have still been rational for me to say, well, maybe I'm within the standard deviation and I'm not going to commit. I want more than 55%, 55% or more before I'll believe. Now, I've abandoned that standard. I can get it. That was one of your objections. I can get into why I think that's wrong, but
Yeah, we can hit that later.
Later, okay.
Yeah.
So the standard deviation for me is no longer a factor. Why is just greater than 50% good enough? Because remember premise 9 of my argument that God himself is ensuring that I'm warranted despite my use of subjective probabilities. As long as I can prove that I'm within what I call the reasonableness range, there can be varieties, right? So I force belief. I say, no, I'm not. Do your own dang calculations. I guarantee you're not going to get the same. I was about 72% for the shroud when I converted. I was 57% for the appearance to the 12. I'm not saying, oh, that is the number. No, you're going to get your own numbers when you assess that. And the reasonableness range, depending on the strength of the evidence, may be wider or narrower for certain parts of evidences. It may be that the reasonableness range you could disbelieve in a given evidence, but where premise 9 of my argument comes in is God cannot allow for any undue confusion. So minimally, as long as you're a reasonable real seeker, you will assign your numbers within the reasonableness range. They'll be different. That's permitted. That's just called permissivism in epistemology, kind of thing, right? And then so different levels of credences can fall within this reasonableness range. And God's job is to ensure that after you plug in Bayes, what do I use Bayes for? At the end of the day, it's just to get a cumulative probability. I assign my own subjective values as a reasonable real seeker within that range. And at the end of the day, the overall probability, God has to ensure that's greater than 50% if Christianity is the religion he wants us to follow.
Let me just ask a real quick question before I have to get up again. And I am listening when I get up, just so you know. Yeah. So why do the math if we're starting with highly subjective numbers, why not just jump to the conclusion that you're trying to figure out, which is there are religion affirming events that support Christianity. Why not just start with that and ask yourself, how do you feel about that proposition?
So here's
Why do all of this subjectivity with this other stuff? Since you're dealing with subjectivity anyway, just go straight to the source and do that. What's Bayes doing for
So
you?
here's why this is why I think I'm so brilliant, even though I'm not. But this is the brilliance of the method, let's say. So look, I fully admit we've all, whether you're an atheist, whatever, you're all, whether you admit it and do it so explicitly or not, you're all assigning subjective probability values to the various elements. I mean, it just so happened, and then that's the GIGO 1 problem. If there's garbage in, garbage out. And that's where I have the standard. Well, if you're a reasonable real seeker, you don't have to worry about GIGO 1 because God will ensure that you're within that range, right? But so yeah, potentially with subjective probabilities, there is the potential someone's unreasonable or they're a non-real seeker and they'll get some garbage in and that will screw up the results. Here's why though. I avoid GIGO too, because there's, in addition to screwing up your evaluation or assessment subjectively of the individual bits, when you put that together, what do you do, David? You just jumble it up in your head and you say, overall Christianity's false. No, that even if you prove the shroud, no, look at God, he's acting like a bugger in the Old Testament. That outweighs any
I
evidence.
got to tell you, no, that's not how I do it. I'm not doing a subjective calculation of each of the individual bits. I am doing a subjective, I suppose, and I wouldn't use the word calculation, gut check of whether I believe God is real or not, whether God is calling me to do something or not. It's very binary to me, and so I don't need to go through a bunch of intermediate states and assign numbers to them.
Isn't the reason for doing the math here the same reason that we might make a list of pros and cons for an important decision? Because what we actually want to do is assure ourselves that our gut instinct is actually how things would line up if we used otherwise objective tools. Isn't this just a way?
Right. I
to
understand
help us
that.
along with a list of pros and cons?
Andrew, I understand that part, but God is not a list of pros and cons. Not to me.
I think that's what we were arguing here.
Right.
Is that God is a list of pros and cons. Darren said, well, I start out at 0. Dell says, sorry, Dell, I don't remember the number you used now. It might be 100% as a result of PBB, but whatever it is, I think we were arguing.
But I'm answering the question for
list
me.
Of pros and cons.
We argue a list of pros and cons if we're doing the math, and I actually want to do the project of figuring out how this math works and do the daily and probability math just as an exercise. But whether God exists or not, is not a list of pros and cons to me. It is a singular.
Okay.
Let me finish my thought.
Yeah.
It is a singular proposition, and it is a relationship. You, Andrew, are not a list of pros and cons to me. There may be a list of pros and cons as to whether we want to do shows or not, but I know that you are there, and you're either worth my time to have a relationship with, or you're not. I'm not really doing a shopping list with God. He is the all in all, who is going to have some kind of eternal destiny for me, or he's not. And I don't have any intermediate points that I have to think about to get there. And if it is not clear to me that he exists and that he is how he has been presented to me, I am not going to follow through with some exercise of pretending like he is because he came up, there's 46% chance that God could be real. That's not how I do it. I'm going to let you finish your thought. I'm going to go ahead and do what I do and clear my mic. And then I'm going to ask Tyler, who is the best looking person on the show, if he wants to step in at this point and say something.
So the question I was answering, David, was not why you should do it, but why anybody making a list of pros and cons would do it. Why I might do it, although I haven't. So I wasn't answering the question for you, David Johnson. I was answering the general question that you asked, which is why do the math? And that answer that I gave was based on the background of this conversation that we are actually discussing. The likelihood of various kinds of evidence and how we would check if we decided we wanted to, that our gut feeling about the evidence lined up with a more objective assessment. Well, sorry,
Yeah,
please
no,
take the
that's
mic
exactly.
because I should have shut up anyway a long time
No,
ago.
that you got it exactly correct, Andrew. Like this is what I'm going to say. My use of Bayes' theorem prevents me. My numbers are entirely objective in terms of the cumulative assessment. Again, assuming I didn't commit Geiger one and my inputs are correct, the cumulative assessment is entirely objective, mathematical proven. It's not the same as somebody else who just, I put my numbers out and then I get, assuming those numbers aren't Geiger one, I get my mathematically guaranteed result to go overall 53.14. That's better and superior to a guy who has all these individual pieces and just jumbles them up in his head and says, well, I think I'm overall about 60%. No, using Bayes' theorem helps you to use those individual pieces and get a guaranteed result. Again, it's still debatable whether you're committing Geiger one or not. That's a debate for a different time. And I would say even the guy who at least breaks things up and says, okay, let me consider the ontological argument, let me consider the various arguments for and against God, and even the ones that just jumble that up subjectively in their head, that's superior, I would argue, to what David's doing, where he's just saying, look, there are probabilities, but there's only one. The sufficiency threshold is 100%. You either exist, prove you exist absolutely, or I don't believe you, or you don't exist. It's 100% and 0%. And that's not the way to go either. That's one of his objections right here, right? So David advances pragmatic encroachment theory, and I think this is highly controversial. I'll post some papers for and against this on my blog for people, but the pragmatic stakes should not play any role in epistemology as to whether we believe or don't believe something. I teach and believe fully in the principles of rational and proportional belief. There's three main attitudes to have. Look, if something is greater than 50%, that means that proposition is probably true, and you apportion your belief accordingly. The practical stakes of that belief, the truth of that belief, don't matter. We should believe what is probably true. Same 49% to 0%, then we disbelieve. Again, apportioned to whatever degree it is. And then again, when we're in the 50-50, that's where we suspend judgment. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. Maybe the hypothesis is false. So this is just the straightforward evidentialist default standard that we all have. And if you want to argue, as David's doing, well, no, look, you can give me 99% evidence or evidence that it's true, God exists. I'm still not going to believe him. Why? Because the practical stakes are so high that I need 100% proof that God exists before I'll believe. This is what
Dale,
philosophers
you're not representing me
Okay.
exactly accurately, and I,
Okay.
I I don't think you're doing it on purpose. But
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
So it's a subtle difference, and I'll try to be clear about the subtlety.
Okay.
I am not saying that my belief in God is 30% or 10%, or that you have to have 100% evidence, because I don't think that's how belief works at all. That's not how belief works in my head. So what I am saying is I either believe he exists or I don't. Now, I don't know what quote unquote percentage of evidence has to be in my head before it flips the switch that says I believe this or I don't. Those are mechanisms that I think are beyond our doxastic control. What I am saying about God is not a number or a process or a philosophy. He is a being in relationship. And he is either a being in relationship with you or he is not. That is binary. And what I am saying is that I do not have any experience with this God. And I honestly don't care what the numbers show if all I've got for it is numbers. And I think that the thing that Christians push back on with this theory is the idea that you can know God based on philosophical arguments. And I don't think you can. You can make your case that all of these philosophical arguments prove God, and that doesn't mean a thing if you don't have relationship with this God. Before you come in, I just want to see if Tyler has anything to say there.
Well, I just wanted to ask you something, but
Sure.
I'll let Tyler go because he's been quiet.
Hey guys, thanks. I'm here with my kids running around. That's why I've been muted mostly. No, David, I think you're spot on, and I mean I say this as a theist still, and I was pretty wildly skeptical of Bayesian types of arguments, even when I was a fully committed Christian. For largely that reason is that I just and you're saying it actually far more eloquently than I could. Is just it feels like it's a process that's good when we're able to pretty clearly calculate prior probabilities. We know what some of the numbers are. It works in science. It works in physics. It seems to me that no matter what you do with Bayes, maybe not garbage in, garbage out, but bias in, bias out. And it's one of the reasons why you get Richard Carrier and Richard Swinburne, the two competing Richards, using Bayesian analysis, and one saying, well, the resurrection is impossible, and the other saying the resurrection is impossible to not have happened. And they're using the exact same methodology because they're largely using they're using the same method, which is to put their bias in first. So I appreciate the nuance of Dale's approach to it. I kind of look at it like a modal ontological argument, where I think it's actually a good argument, although I don't with Bayes. But if someone thinks it's a good argument, that's fine. But I just question then the kind of apologetical value of it, and wonder how many people would actually be convinced by something like this if they didn't already find the prior probabilities convincing. So that would be largely my pushback and thoughts on it.
Thanks. Dale, I'm going to ask you to hold off one more second. I want to bring in Mag Attack. And before I do, I just want to, while it's on my mind, I'd appreciate the opportunity to say this. Mag Attack and I have had a discordant relationship on the board where our worst tendencies tend to come out. But I think that Mag Attack is good people. He's my kind of people. And I just want to publicly apologize for anything that I did to push him into being his worst self while I was being my worst self. And you should not look at either myself or Mac Attack as we battle on the boards and think that's who we are. And I want to represent who I am better in every aspect of my life. And so I just wanted to make that apology to you, Mac Attack, and I really appreciate you stopping by.
Talk to you.
All right, go ahead, Dale.
Okay. Okay. So, I guess there's so much to do. So, David, I'll start with you. Just a quick question then. So, if I'm understanding you correctly, let's pretend, for the sake of argument, I use that modal ontological argument, which I think is the strongest, and I think it's unreasonable. A person who it must be an unreasonable or a non-real seeker if they don't think that the ontological argument is, at the very least, probable proof. That's how strong I think the argument is that the reasonableness range is very narrow for it.
Mhm.
But let's pretend I convince you, and I get you 100%. You're like, on the basis of the ontological argument, yeah, I'm convinced 100% that God exists, but you still lack that relationship aspect. Are you saying you're going to disbelieve in him because of that?
Yes.
Okay.
Because if the God of the ontological argument existed, I wouldn't need the ontological argument to know it.
Okay. So I would, uh, uh, so you're presenting that as a negative evidence then, right? Like in
Right.
the
So I'm
100%.
saying that you could come up with a philosophy that I can't defeat because I'm not a philosopher any more than I'm a mathematician. But God can't be reduced to that. And so I can bow and grant you the win on the math, just like I did with the 50-50 argument. Okay, I was wrong. Great. That didn't get me one step closer to an actual encounter with this God of yours. So you can win, and there's still no God.
Gotcha. Well, you wouldn't say that if I've won in the 100% degree, there is a God, and you believe you. I would say that it's irrational. You have to believe in him. Now, it's a totally separate question. When I came to belief in Christianity that the Christian God is true, that didn't entail that, oh, I had a relationship with him or I committed to him. That was a separate step after the belief. Think of the demons. They believe 100%. They know
Okay,
God
but no
and
one
Jesus is
came to
God. But
belief in God because of an argument like that. They came
I
to
did.
belief in, okay, one person came to belief in God because of an
I'm not
argument
alone.
like that.
William Lane Craig. There's
Um,
many people that it could work, right?
yeah, William Lane Craig is a freaking robot. So I love the guy. I think he's a good teacher, but you're not making your case. You're making mine. And the God of the Bible is the kind of God that introduces himself, that taps you on the shoulder, that knocks you off your horse on your ass and say, "Why are you persecuting me?" The God of the Bible doesn't leave you any doubt about whether the God of the Bible is there and what he wants. So if your arguments are correct, then all it tells me is that there's a second God out there, perhaps, or a different kind of God. But it doesn't get me any closer to your Christian God.
It's not true because it's consistent with it, right? Like the arguments are designed to only prove so much.
Like
So
I
it's
said, if
it's
you
like
need the argument to get to God, the God of that argument probably is not real. That is
okay,
that is
okay.
my
That's
instinct and knowledge of um going toward 50 years, let's call it 45 years of intense Bible study. And that's background knowledge that I would use to plug into Bayes.
right. Okay. So I'll just take your point, and I disagree. I don't think that's a good. You would have to meet your burden of proof that that is the
Right. And
case.
and I
But
would and I would if I were doing that formula, which I would love to do, which gets us
well, here,
back around to I want to
well, here,
see your formula and how it works to get you where you are.
right. So, okay, and here's my last question then. So, let's
Hey,
pretend I
hey,
convince you 100% not based on the ontological argument, but through the way most people in the Bible and most people throughout human history have come to convince, which entails this relationship, a properly basic belief formed by the Holy Spirit witnessing to your spirit. That
Yes,
if
I
that
would
was in the
believe.
100%, you would. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Okay. Cool. So yeah, it's just a debate about what types of evidence are valid. And somebody else was trying to speak. So sorry, go ahead, whoever you are.
yeah, it's this Tyler. I had kind of a follow up, and maybe you can show an easy disanalogy between these two things. I'm not exactly sure. Um, but if David could prove to you in a Bayesian type of way that there was um, that there was I don't know if you're married or not, but let's just say not that you were married and that you had the most loving wife in the world, the most loving doting wife in the world, who loves you to the world and back and would do anything for you. He just convinced you that by based on the probability that exists, but you have never met her, you've never walked with her, you've never seen her do anything for you, all that kind of stuff. Would you actually say, oh well, yes, I guess I am in this true loving relationship with this person because of Bayes?
Mm. Okay, so it's so this is kind of like the hiddenness of God. So He does provide me with a sufficient amount of warrant to say, yes, this is probably true, or even 100%, let's say, through non-experiential means, purely through propositions and stuff like that, that it's true. Then, yes, if it follows the laws of logic, I will apportion my belief according to the evidence. I don't demand or require one evidence. If I'm warranted, I'm warranted. I don't care how I obtain that warrant. Does that make sense? Or
It
So
does. I think it's just a very hard bullet to bite. But I mean, at least you're consistent.
I think this actually leads nicely into having Dale. So Dale, what is your percentage of like the cosmological argument adding to the belief that Christianity is true?
all right, hang on 1 second, because I can actually tell you. Because I this is the one argument that I've actually written up and done all the work on, so I can actually give you the precise. Uh,
Yeah, and
check.
I really do want to see at least some of that work. You don't have to answer this, Dale. You can talk to me offline or answer it at the very end. How many people? What is the percentage of people on Earth, in your opinion, who could do this process? Because I'm not even sure that I'm one of the people on Earth that can do this process. It's got to be less than 10%.
If you, I don't know, if you actually like, you mean what I've done here?
Yeah.
If
Yeah,
you've actually,
the whole schmear, doing all of the work that I assume that you've put into it and that I want to see and inquire about. But how many people could pull that off? How long would it take? I mean, that's
it would take a long time because it took me 8 years. But again, that was me doing different stuff. I went over every argument I accepted with like talking it out with Gary Habermas and others. I did 3 separate independent assessments, each with an increasing level of depth to the research, right? And stuff like that.
that
But
is a
so someone,
huge commitment to a process. And I just I I find it intimidating and unrealistic that most people could do a process like this, let alone understand it.
like 82.27%, Darren.
Okay,
Now,
so
go ahead.
so if your percentage is 82.27,
Mhm.
then if it's going to be a number that Bayes can actually use to show the truth of a proposition and not just that you believe the proposition to be true, then there should be some way for those of us who don't share your intuitions to reach this 82.27%, right? So so what is that method? How did you go from the argument to the actual percentage? Because I think that's what a lot of us are actually interested in.
Well, we'll see. So this is what I'm saying, though. This isn't the number. I guarantee you, you will get a different one. I guarantee you it.
Yeah, but we
I'm
just
also
want to see how you got to yours.
well,
We just want to
read
understand it.
this 200-page thing, or listen to my 12-hour YouTube
I
video,
have.
Well,
or we
It's
can
good.
summarize it in our
Try
future
it.
show. So I've done that with this argument. At least I can say here it is, and it's for free for everyone. But the
well, I
point
think the
is,
problem then, if that's the case, is that you have your the
well, I was
measurement
about
that
to
you're
agree.
making is just your belief. It's not truth of reality.
No, I'm going
Well,
to
okay,
speak up for Dale
so in
here.
the first place,
I
let
think
me address with this because
it's
Darren.
not arbitrary. He's not. I don't believe he's giving you any kind of arbitrary number. I think he's worked it out. And
Well,
what?
except it is kind of arbitrary because his strongest argument is the modal ontological argument. He feels that that's the strongest. I think it's the strongest to show that God doesn't exist. So there is, if we're just going by people's subjective
Well, Darren, so
numbers, then the Bayes doesn't actually tell us anything
But
about how reality works.
I really
let
want
me
Dale to
let
have a
me
chance to make that case, though, because I mean, Dale, sincere. This is sincere, David. This is not polemic, David. I would love to follow along with your work and be able to use it if it's good. and I don't understand enough of it to even get started with the process.
Okay, so let me first clarify Darren's point then, right? So believe it or not, Darren is semi-right that when these are subjective probabilities, these are unique to me. Okay, I'm not
You
saying
keep saying that Darren's
everyone.
right and I'm wrong, and this is not,
No, because I'm not
and I'm
I'm
trying
not
to be
arguing
charitable.
objectively.
He said he was semi-right. There's a,
Yeah,
Yeah, he said
semi-right.
believe it or not, so I'm not sure if that's
So believe it then, right? So I'm not saying that 82.27%, that's what everyone who reads my work or is privy to the exact same evidence that I am will arrive at that number, right? I'm not arguing that I've come up, as per the uniqueness thesis, I've come up with the one credence level that is the number. All I'm arguing for is that I've presented objectively all of my reasoning and broken it up into all the bits and the different probability values I get for the different components. And I guess I'll take you through that since David wants to see that, how I got there. But then once I arrive at that, my argument is that this 82.27% is within the reasonableness range. I am a reasonable person in assigning this level.
well,
Another,
except the problem with that is that you believe you're reasonable to assign that percentage. I don't. So
But
we have
I
had
would
some way.
agree. I would agree with Dale's last statement that if he has a real number that gets to that range, you would be reasonable to accept it at 80
Well,
some or whatever
but I
percent.
wouldn't, because I don't think that number accurately represents reality.
Right, but if the
So
number did, he would be
right, but
reasonable
that's
to
the
accept it.
if it did, sure, but I don't believe that he's reasonable to assign that number
Well,
to
that's
it,
what we
and
haven't
that's the
seen.
problem.
That's
hey
that's
guys,
where we'll debate.
isn't there a way to decide the difference here though? There's a pretty easy test here, it seems to me, to find out whether Dale is reasonable or not. And that is to take whatever tools Dale is about to propose, because he's trying to, and to take the rules that he's proposing for deciding that the ontological argument is good evidence. Sorry, Dale, I don't remember the number you got. 82.27, whatever the number was. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
To take whatever tools he used to assess the validity of the ontological argument and to apply those to other things that we might all objectively agree are true. And if the tools he uses against the ontological argument also work in other real world scenarios, then maybe he's onto something. But if
Well,
we
except
can't,
you would want to test it against things that we all agree is false. Actually, not
okay,
true.
fair, yeah,
But
look,
that's
okay,
fine.
that's fair. That's absolutely true. I accept the correction, but you see the point.
Everybody
Right?
is saying the same thing ultimately, which puts the spotlight on Dale, and it's his show, which is show us the work. And those of us who maybe can do it and are interested in it, help us to be able to apply that work. So I mean, there are two things that I want. The first one may or may not be a reasonable curiosity. I just want to see for myself if your work stands up to your conclusion. I want to see how you got there. See if there are some major flaws there. I want to be able to judge it. But more than that, because I'm not a mathematician, so I don't even know that I could judge it properly. I want to be able to use it and see if when I plug in my numbers, if I generate them the same way that, you did, what do I come up with? Other Christians who are listening to this, and I still think this is a thing that should be of interest to other Christians and believers and people on the fence. How, maybe they are, their brains work the same way as yours. How do they do this equation and apply it so that they can come up with a number? And I just want to give you as much floor, not rope, floor as you need to spread out that equation, because that's what I want to highlight. I want to highlight your work on how you got there and how you can help others get there too.
Okay, so I don't understand what you're asking me to show. Are you wanting me to show how I got there in terms of the individual arguments, or are you saying show me the work, just doing like how does Bayes actually would work if
Well,
I
sure, you
plugged in
can't
numbers?
unspool 8 years of equations. I understand that, but you can give us broad brushstrokes. These were your starting premises. This was your background knowledge. This was your evidence. These are the numbers you assigned to them. This is just roughly generally how you came to that number as opposed to some other number. Just give us a draft so that someone can follow it.
And
Because right now it's
specifically,
just voodoo to me right now.
Okay.
yeah.
So with premise one, right? God exists. Okay. So this is I haven't done the ontological argument. This is the 82.27% is the cosmological argument.
Okay.
Okay. So I've written 200 pages there. So you want, what are the premises of my argument?
Yeah,
So
I mean,
like,
the roughest sketch, the roughest numbers on those sketches. I'm not going to ask you to unfold all the way back to the creation of the universe. So cosmological argument,
So
80 odd percent.
E2,
So, obviously
Okay,
that was very favorable. What were some of the other factors and numbers you plugged in?
Okay, so in order to arrive at the 82.27%, so number one, you asked for the premises, right? So I have a simple premise that this is not a Kalam cosmological argument, it's a contingency argument, which
Okay.
means that it works whether the universe began to exist in the finite past or is eternal. Either way, this argument can work.
Mhm.
So premise one is the universe exists contingently, or it's a contingent existing thing.
Mhm.
Premise two, generally speaking, every existing thing, whether contingent or necessary, has a sufficient explanation of its existence,
Mhm.
either in the necessity of its own internal nature or an external cause. So this is just the principle of sufficient reason that you'll recognize from like William Lane Craig.
Mhm.
And then finally, premise three, if the universe has a sufficient explanation of its contingent existence, that explanation is what I call the God one hypothesis. And the reason I call that is because when we get to on the negative side, there are about 4 categories of objection. The last of which is the most powerful is the gap problem. And that's where, okay, great, you've got this cause of the universe, necessary cause of the universe, the contingent universe, and all of that, and its contingent existence. Now tell me about the properties. How do we determine that's God? Maybe it's just some being or something like that. And in addressing the gap problem, that's where I establish all the properties that we can prove on the basis of this argument alone. That does not get you a real maximally great being. It gets you what I call God one.
Mhm.
And then I'm going to depend on other arguments to fill in more properties and eventually get to the real maximally great being. So that's why this is part of a cumulative case. But if you want the specific, you said the percentages for what, each premise or something?
Well, yeah, I mean, just so that we can kind of follow along and understand how you landed on your number.
Mhm. Okay, so premise one is pretty straightforward, I believe. There should be a percentage there, but the universe is a contingent existing thing. So this is where I think this one is pretty self-evident, right?
No,
And
it's not.
stuff. So it's what does it mean to be a thing? There are 3 types of things in mereology. There are substances, there are property things, and there are heaps. So I think it's, again, my premise doesn't matter, but I think that the universe is a property thing. So it's not a substance. It doesn't maintain unity through part changes in the parts or the relations of it. For example, so anyways, yeah, so it's a thing. Does the universe exist? Yes. What does it mean to exist? Well, that is a relation. It is an exemplification relation. It's when a thing exemplifies certain properties. Well, yeah, the scientists have studied the universe and it has certain properties.
How are you defining universe?
So I define universe as basically everything that exists. I actually gave not everything that exists, but where's my specific definition?
Just so you know,
Uh,
I don't plan to
It would
debate
include
you.
the multiverse.
I don't plan to debate you on any of this stuff today. This is, a month down the road. But That's why
Yeah,
I'm
but
just kind of letting you spool it out so that I can at least see where you applied your reasoning and how you kind of came up with your subjective numbers. It just gives us a chance to
Okay.
look inside the box a little bit.
All right. Well, I would just like to point out that if you're defining universe as to include the multiverse, then most cosmologists don't consider multiverse to be a contingent thing. So
Yeah,
I think
A very good point that will fit
well,
very well in the next show.
I'm just pointing that out so that when he's telling us how he came to the
Doesn't matter.
percentages,
Doesn't matter. He could be wrong about every point. At least we would see where it came from.
so this is where aspect 2 comes in, and I provide several lines of evidence. This is the bulk of my chapter. It's over 130 pages. The universe is contingent and not logically necessary. Darren and the scientists are wrong on this front, and I provide my reasoning. So I provide, I think one is a modal argument. Well, I know Darren's not gonna, he doesn't accept modal logic, but that's tough. This is part of my reasoning, and I think it's warranted. I have a properly based belief via my modal evaluating faculties that there can be different multiverses and that sort of thing, and there can be differences in the parts and or relations of the universe as we have it. It's also logically possible that the universe just didn't exist at all. That's possible. So that's my first argument. I know that's not going to be convincing for Darren because he rejects like modal logic.
Doesn't matter. You don't have to prove it today.
Okay, cool.
You don't have to get caught up with that. I'm still
Don't
just
get
trying
it.
to get a sketch of how you did your math.
Okay, cool. So for this premise, I assigned a very conservative 95% then that the universe is a contingent existing thing. That's the number that I got to in the end.
Okay.
One thing I will say for Darren's benefit, though, one of the arguments that I have for the contingency of the universe does involve cosmology, and that means I have to prove that it's the universe began to exist. And I make an abductive argument where I go over every single eternal cosmological model and I compare it to the standard Big Bang, the modified Big Bang, and what I call the unspecified finite model of the universe. And I find that the best explanation of the data we have is that the universe began to exist in some point in the finite past.
I personally don't find the cosmological argument as interesting as all that, because I don't care if it began to exist or not. You could have a universe that wasn't contingent, and there could still be a God. Now, that might put a question on whether he created the universe, but it doesn't matter whether he created the universe. He can still be the God of the universe. And so I don't necessarily find God as creator, and therefore I don't care. I don't care whether it was contingent on something or whether it wasn't. You still have to prove God.
The reason it matters, if I don't think it is, the universe is logically necessary. That creation isn't necessary for God, but who cares about that debate kind of thing. The fact is, if my argument works and I've proven the universe is in fact contingent and not necessary in itself, then it requires, as per premise 2, that requires a sufficient explanation for it to exist. So that's where I get into premise 2.
Sure.
I'm sorry, can I say something? Sorry, this is Matt. Just wanted to say that what David just said is true. If the universe was not created by a superior being or a transcendental being, then there's no point in anyone having to worship a God who's also part of the universe. I just think that being would end up being just a highly evolved creature that no one should worship. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, you're a little bit faint.
He was saying that he does believe that it is important that a God would create the universe, because if the universe was not contingent and a God did not create it, but that God existed, there would be no point in worshiping that God.
Oh, sure. Yeah, there may be theological significance. There's definitely theological significance.
Not even just reasonably, there would be no reason to for God who's also part of the created order, because they themselves are part, like they're also a creature like us.
Okay,
Right.
so I didn't make out.
He was saying that in that event, God would just be a creature like us, and so there would be no point in simply worshiping another creature. If I can add to that, even if that creature was somehow taxonomically higher than us, he's still just a creature in the universe. My dog doesn't have to worship me, and I don't have to worship an alien. But it would have to be the God who created it all in order to make worshiping him make any sense at all. Magatak, have I summarized that correctly?
Yeah, you said it better than I did.
Okay,
That's right.
I pretty much agree. Like I believe God. One of the definition, God is a real maximum great being. He has to be exist a se, right? He's the creator of everything and stuff like that. But what I meant when I kind of said that's irrelevant, I mean it's irrelevant with respect to this argument, because this argument isn't based on the universe, whether it exists necessary or not. Now, someone could say, well, the universe exists, they're like numbers, it exists, but it's a necessary dependent. It's dependent on God for its existence, which to me just translates to it being contingent again, right? It's if God doesn't exist, it doesn't exist. But um, yeah, again, the fact is, according to my argument, the universe is, as a matter of fact, contingent. So I don't need to get into any implications or debate, well, what if it is logically necessary? What would that mean in terms of its relationship to God and stuff? Like,
Right.
cool,
But
we can
for
debate
the
that another day.
cosmological argument to make up 82, I just keep forgetting the number. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to mock it.
No,
82% of God exists. You have to get from there to God. And I know that once again, this is not what you came prepared to do, but I'm just trying to understand that 82% number, because right now, so far, there's nothing in the cosmological argument that you've stated that I couldn't grant and still not get to that lofty 82%.
right, because we're at 95%. We're just on the first premise, and I'm kind of going over some of the elements as to how I got. So basically, I when I assign my percentage for each premise, what I do is I multiply them, right? So let's say premise one is 95%. Premise two, I prove that 99%. And then premise three, I prove that 80% or so, just for the sake of argument.
Mm-hmm.
Then I multiply all of those together, and that's what gets me that final 82%. And it's the same with my 11 premise argument, right? So
Okay.
I don't use Bayes at all. It's more Bayes is just used for evaluating what is that overall percentage for some premises, like premise one, God exists, or premise 11, that there are religion authenticating
But
events.
tell us the process that you use then to come up with the numbers. Then we're obviously not going to get through the whole formula, but if you're looking at premise one, um, the universe exists, or is that premise two? Um, the universe exists seems like an easy 100%er.
Well,
The
there's
universe
some
is
that argue.
contingent would be, now you'd have to, sit in a good easy chair and have a good old think to come up with a number. How are you how are you attaching a number to a premise?
Yeah, so this is where I go over the reasons. So believe it or not, I even evaluated as part of my thing. I challenged that the universe is an existing thing, just in general, that it exists. And I appealed to things like solipsism, or Nick Bostrom's argument for a virtual universe, that this is just even now, that said, even if it is a virtual universe, one of my comebacks is, well, it's still a virtual universe is an existing thing, so
So is
it doesn't
solipsism.
matter. But
So neither one of those are objections to the universe exists.
that's true, but then the universe would have to be redefined to include just one peep, one person,
Well,
or
no, I
something,
think
and
the
that's
universe
not.
would be defined as all that there is. So it doesn't
no,
matter how much of it there actually is or whether we perceive it correctly. It is, even if
yeah.
it is only the part of our brain that tells us that it is.
So here's my definition of universe. It's William Lane Craig's all of space and time and its contents.
Okay, I'm
That's what
there.
I define universe.
Great.
Okay,
So it exists. Even if
cool.
that is one
And
atom, it exists.
okay, so then I
Easy
assign then
100%. I'm not sure why it would have taken you, I don't know why you would have had to break that one down. But I'm just saying some of the
because
others
I'm
where you're
being thorough,
getting
right?
lower numbers, how just take any one number that's, around anywhere between 50 and 80% and just tell me how you thought through that process to get there.
So, okay, so you keep asking that, and I think I believe that I'm answering it, but it seems not to be working for you.
Right. So,
I break it down. So, okay, so in this case, premise one, God exists.
mhm,
One of my reasons for thinking that is the argument from contingency proves he probably exists. Okay, then I break it down. Well, what are the three premises of my argument? To make a deductive argument, I listed those. Then I evaluate each premise in turn and the reasons for and against the truth of each premise. And I assign, so I had about 4 or 5 arguments kind of thing. And I assign probabilities, subjective probabilities to those, to each individual element of those sub arguments. Right. So that's why at first, like what a sub element would be that, okay, well, what's the probability I prove that the universe is an existing thing? I evaluate the arguments for and against, and let's say I give it 100% because it seems self-evident. Yep, the universe exists. Okay. Um, so that's where the subjective probability comes in. Assessing the objective reasons for and against, and then I'm making my assessment of that. If there are multiple components, kind of thing, that so let's say I have 3 arguments that prove the universe is an existing thing. They each prove that independently. That's where I would use Bayes to. So after I assign my subjective probabilities to each of those 3 elements, then I plug that into Bayes, and overall, I'm 99% that the universe is an existing thing. Then I move on to the second component. Okay, is the universe is a contingent existing thing, and I look at the arguments for and against, and I assign my subjective probabilities to each individual element. Again, only using Bayes if there are multiple components that prove that the universe is contingent. And in this case, I did have multiple arguments. I had 2 philosophical arguments. Again, the ones William Lane Craig and Alexander Proust were heavily influential on this argument for me. So you've heard William Lane Craig's philosophical arguments. I gave my modal argument. And I also had my scientific abductive argument where I went over all the models and I made an inference to the best explanation that the universe began to exist. If the universe is not eternal, it's by definition contingent because eternality is a necessary requisite for something to be logically necessary. If it's even possible for it not to exist, let alone factually didn't exist for at all points or all time or whatever, then it's not necessary because look, there are conditions at time one that don't require it and that don't make it necessary.
let me make a proposition. You're
Yeah.
I feel like I have backed you into a corner that uh, you're not supposed to be in today. Because I just wanted to have you explain your method and not argue your case for the existence of God. That's something that we agreed that we would do at a different time. And I don't think it's fair to you if that's how you're interpreting my inquiries, and it could be that that's just the natural conclusion to where my inquiries go. So I retract my inquiries because I'm not trying to force you to make that case today. I will ask those who remain standing, if you like, it is not required, to prepare a kind of a closing thought because Dale and I are going to pick this up again. Hopefully, we'll all pick this up again in about a month because inherent in all of Dale's uh, major arguments is God exists. That's at the beginning of all of it. And we, we could just say, well, no, he doesn't. But that's not useful. And so I won't Dale because he's clearly done the work to be able to make a clear, cogent, if not concise case for God exists. And we can go through that at a time and in a way that's going to be more fair to Dale. But I think, Dale's presentation was very good. I think there was some good pushback, some good clarification. I learned some things today that I did not know. I don't know how I will use those things in my life, but I did learn some things. I was wrong while trying to defend Dale against Darren the demonstrator twice. I was rebuffed and told, nope, Darren's right. So I have had enough of Darren being right for one day, damn it. So no one can tolerate more than Darren being right twice in one day. So let's just kind of put a pin in it there and think about some closing comments. And I'll go first to give other people time to think about it. And Dale, you can go last and have the last word and shape that any way you want. So I'm going to start off by just saying thank you for listening. This may come out as 2 episodes. Not sure. Thank you for listening, though. And thank you for all of the participants who stopped by and who couldn't make it to the end, but they stopped by and participated and shared. And for those people who did get back to me, who wanted to participate, but who could not because of prior engagements, this has been interesting and almost a little surprising. It did not go exactly where I thought it would go. But I'm glad it went where it did. And I think this is the kind of dialogue that people of good faith can have. So I will, I'll just throw this in here. I'm probably looking at one more knee surgery because when you get hit with a van, it's a gift that keeps on giving. And I have rehabbed well, but there were lingering issues, and my knee is at the point where it has no stability left in it. It's just kind of, the joint kind of flops around a bit. Hurts, and I fall, because if you're walking and you're not hanging on to something, and the one leg you're on is the one that flops around, you're gonna go down. So that's kind of embarrassing, and so I mention it just to be embarrassed publicly and remind myself that I am as human as everyone else. And boy, does that sting. But orthopedic surgeons are looking at me. I am supposedly in good hands. Something about a total knee reconstruction, whatever the heck that means. And, it'll happen probably soon. I don't have, exact details right now, but that's coming. And the only reason I mention it is because that's going to affect frequencies of, how shows come out. And the last time I went through this, I still continued to do shows, which was probably ill-advised. And I'm going to do it ill-advised again because the shows and the comments are actually my therapy. They are a part of my rehab process. It's a part of what keeps me mentally here, and to the degree that I am stable. So I will do them, but this will definitely have an effect on them, and that is coming up. And as for my last word about this particular presentation, I think I land kind of where I started and where I was in the middle. which is to say that any God that needs to be proven by math or philosophy and cannot be accessed any other way is probably not the God for me, even if he does exist. Because at the end of the day, I'm not. No one is in relationship with a God that exists. They're in relationship with a God that is relating to them, and mathematically quantifying how existing that God is just doesn't matter. I mean, I don't. I've said this before. I don't care if that God exists any more than I care about whether aliens exist. And I think that that could be even have a greater bearing on our life. And for the record, I do think that aliens probably do exist, and they're far enough away that we're never going to know it. But that said, they're far enough away so that it's never going to matter. And if a God exists, but he's so far away that I can't reach him and he can't reach me, I, I don't, that math will never add up to me as to why it should matter. So that said, I will move around this clock to Mr. iPhone. Andrew, Darren, if you have anything last to say. And Mac Attack, you are welcome to make a comment, and we'll finish with Dale. Andrew.
It seems to me that the problem we have with trying to apply some systemology to this conversation is that the data we are all struggling with is of poor enough quality that trying to put math around it simply doesn't make sense because the error bars become larger than the quality of the data can support. So I'm not a big fan, even though I like the idea. I'm not a big fan of trying that here. Now, it may be that in the future, as we refine our data, this could get better and better. I don't know. I don't know what we will discover tomorrow. But at the moment, I think that we are better off spending our time elsewhere. The second problem that I had today, and I worked pretty hard to find a way to make what we talked about generally here applicable to non-religious studies. And after I did that work today and in previous shows and on boards and privately, the methods that we talked about today don't appear to have good general applicability. I don't mean Bayes. I mean the way we are trying to use Bayes here. There was no clear way, and we all ended up acknowledging that there was no clear way to use Bayes, and for any of us to achieve the same outcome. And what Bayes is good at in the places where it is applicable is helping researchers and data analysts and people that need to carve out finite data. It's good at helping those groups achieve the same sorts of outcomes or to evaluate each other's outcomes. And what we discovered here today is that we don't have a general applicability. Darren can't get to Dale's numbers. Dale can't get to Darren's numbers. David can't get to Dale or Darren's number. And we could go on and on. But in the end, not only are we not going to have the same outcomes, we're probably not going to have similar enough outcomes. So for me, I think we're better off going at this conversation some other way. Although I will say this in close. Dale, I enjoyed hearing more about the work you've done. And so I don't want this particular closing to be taken as a dismissal. I think I'm just saying it doesn't work for me in this particular case. But I did enjoy hearing what you had to say as always, and I thought it was well defended. But uh, I think for me, we've got to go about this another way, and I'll leave it there. David, thank you for allowing me to come around and participate in this SNS, and I'll pass the mic to Darren.
Mr. Lute.
Yeah, I would probably echo a lot of what Andrew said. I mean, it's really impressive that Dale has been able to write that many pages. I'm not even an amateur writer. I jot down stories every once in a while, but being able to write that much is always really impressive. But I think the biggest problem that we have here is that we're confusing the unit of measure for the days, because what Dale is saying is that I believe this argument has 0% or whatever X%. And then I come in and I say, well, I've looked at it. I've looked at all the data you have, and I think this argument has Y%. And then because we're talking in I believe this percent, there's no way to get from that to, okay, this percentage indicates that it is actually true in reality. The reason Bayes works in chemistry and physics and all these other sciences is because they're actually looking at the real world and figuring out what the percentages of the actual world are. They're not saying, I believe it's this X%. They're saying, when we look at the world, we find out that it is this percent. And if you're not using Bayes that way, then you can't actually say anything about reality. All you can say at the end of it is, I believe plus I believe plus I believe times I believe equals I believe. And I think that's the major problem with using it in this way. Until you can indicate that your percentages accurately reflect reality, then you just can't get to reality. And saying that, cosmologists are wrong when they're the ones that are actually looking at reality, I just can't see how you get there from I believe.
Mr. Attack.
All right, so I want to say that what Dale wrote, like I didn't know it was 200 pages long, so I just want to commend you for that. Like that is definitely lots of research. And
Brother, that's a subheading for Dale. That's not even a chapter.
And Mac, because I'm reading, I am very disappointed by your comments and stuff. It's not that. Please, if you can do me a favor, all of you, but Mac,
sure.
I don't expect you to read 200 pages, but I've been told by atheists as well that I've got the best on all of the internet, at least the best
Okay.
cosmological argument. So if you could watch my YouTube videos, at least you'll see I'm not just saying I believe, I think. I am giving the reasons objectively. Everyone can consider it, apart from when there's a properly basic belief involved. But the
Sure.
objective evidence, it's there for you. If you would please look at that, and if you feel the same way, I'll be disappointed, but I'll respect that that's your
No,
opinion.
I am open to being wrong about this, but I'm just like at the moment I can only share how I see it or how I understand it. And in a sense, the way I get it is that you're saying that based on how you subjectively understand reality and the things that happen in it, your conclusion is that, well, for the cosmological argument, is that it's 82% right. And I have to agree with everyone else on the panel, even though like I'm leaving it open to being wrong, right? Because I haven't watched all your videos, so I might not be understanding it correctly. But my hesitation with agreeing with you is I see what Darren was saying before, and I agree with him, right? Like I know that's a rare occurrence, but I agree in that it feels like for you, like I'm not saying you're wrong, but you're saying that because you believe to a certain degree that something is true. So like for you, it's X% that you believe this to be true, then that's how you are subjectively arriving at the conclusion. And personally speaking, like I think there are two ways of proving that God exists. There's the subjective way where someone experiences God versus the objective way in which we can get to know who God is. So everyone on this planet is standing close to if believing in God is like jumping off a cliff, right? Let's say someone believes in God and it's jumping off a cliff. I feel like we're all far away from the cliff. Like it just matters how close we are. And if someone's at the edge and they're about to say like, okay, this is where all my objective reasoning gets me, then for them to take that leap of faith, so to speak, that's up to them in a way. It's not up to it's not like they haven't received enough evidence, so to speak. So the major problem I have with your argument, or rather the premise of it, is you're saying it's it's okay to believe in this argument because you believe in it. And I don't think that is going to convince a lot of people. If it has convinced someone, then great, right? But I don't think it's going to convince a lot of people because ultimately it comes down to them believing you and that you've got it down right. And so, at best, your argument convinces someone that a God exists out there, that it's reasonable to believe in a God, but it doesn't actually get them to trust in this God. Like, they're like, okay, that God is very complex for me to understand because it feels like I have to do all this math to understand them. Other than that, I still like I'm a Christian, right? I'm a theist. I believe in God. I believe in Jesus, and so I I think what Andrew said that there's a better way of going about this than just all the math and all that stuff. But I do again commend you for writing all that and doing all the research. Again, nothing to be frowned upon, and definitely will be checking out your videos. Yeah, thanks, and
So
thank you, David, for having me on the show.
absolutely, I'm gonna hand this over to Dale to close us out, but I want to channel Brian a little bit since he's not here to make his own statements. On the board, it was, uh, Brian won't recount all the conversations, agreed to read through the New Testament and make notes and so forth at the behest of someone on the board. Skepticsandseekers.squarespace.com. Log in your Discuss account and discuss away. It's there. It's all over the board. You can see it. And it's great. These are great conversations when they're great. Dumpster fires when they're not. But there's a lot of great stuff there. So Brian is the kind of person who will have strong opinions and still do the work, do the stuff. And I commend him for that. Andrew, Matt, Darren, they've all gone through the Alpha course. And they did that. I didn't join in on that. I've taught a lot of courses to beginning Christians, and I've read the Bible 1,000 times. However, where I am willing to jump in on, even though it goes against so much of my uh, inner self, is one of the reasons I wanted to do this show, and I wanted to give Dale a chance to talk about this process, and if Dale would sit with me for a day or two, offline, I actually want to go through this process that Dale is talking about, and I want to do the math. I'd have to have a lot of hand holding, for the math part, but I want to go through this process and actually see what it would end up if I put in good, honest numbers with the way that Dale thinks, so that I can walk a mile in his shoes and understand where he is in a way that I can't if I don't do that. And I am willing to do that, to go through this process, non-ironically, and see what that looks like. And Dale, I am familiar with your cosmological argument, and I do think it's the best one out there. Now,
You
not
are
that big on the
sold.
cosmological argument, but it's better than Craig's all day, and I know his pretty well. So, I just wanted to let you know, even though sometimes you may have felt persecuted, one against many, I think I speak for the room. Huge respect, huge respect for what you've done and accomplished, and I hope that at some point you do receive the academic attention that your work most certainly deserves. And I'm one of the few human beings that have probably read more of it than most people. And I read a lot of stuff. It's good. So, with that said, I just wanted to hand it to you to close us out, and know that there's nothing but huge respect and love coming your way.
You. Yeah, so I do want to say thank you for the opportunity and that sort of thing. Judging from the feedback and stuff, it doesn't look like it paid off in the way that I was hoping, but that's fine. I gave it my best shot, and I'm willing to work with anyone, because I think if you actually see what I'm doing, it wasn't really explained maybe properly in the show, because some people are just saying that are flat out false. Like, I am in no way am I saying I believe, therefore you should believe. Never uttered my lips. 90 in terms of my arguments and stuff. Sometimes I do appeal to properly based beliefs, and I admit those are subjective evidences, but I never tell others they have to believe on that basis. 90% of my between 90 and 95% of my cosmological argument, which is the one specific example we gave, is objective evidence. Anyone can read it and know the evidence and assess for themselves, am I full of it or not? So this is objective, and I'm presenting these as evidence for you guys to consider. And I've done all the bases. I mean, it is a scientific fact that certain models, like the quantum loop cosmology, entails certain problems with thermodynamics and the second law of thermodynamics. That is a fact published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. That isn't just I believe, therefore. Um, Now, it is true that Darren's point that all of the probabilities, the assessments that I give of these objective reasons are ultimately going to be, when I say 90% versus 89%, that's a subjective probability. And I'm not arguing anyone needs to be there. We don't. We just need to be within this semi objective legal standard of being a reasonable person, and that applies generally to everyone when we're assessing the evidence. Scientists do this, historians do this. Nobody has frequentist probabilities about a certain eternal cosmological model. It's not out there. Certain elements might involve those types of statistical probabilities, but when Sean Carroll's is saying, I think it's equally probable or more probable that his particular model is true, it's impossible for him to come up. Okay, Darren was saying something. It's they don't provide statistical probabilities. We all recognize the validity of subjective probabilities in making decisions and rational decisions. So if you just have an objection to subjective probabilities in general, I guess there's nothing I can say, but I will just say that there's most scientists don't have a problem with it. Historians don't have a problem with it. Philosophers and logicians, people who use decision theory, it's used all the time. And in fact, everyone here, even if you're a Calvinist like McAtack, everyone here, either consciously or unconsciously, is doing exactly the same thing that I do. They're just less explicit by it. Every one of you has made a probability judgment. In David's case, he gave a specific example about an irrelevant point. Of course, it's a separate question about whether 51% versus 100% knowledge is good enough to commit. And in fact, David said, look, even with 100% knowledge, I demand evidence of a certain type before I'll commit. That's a separate question. The Bible recognizes that difference. I'm talking pure epistemology. Don't care about whether I can have 100% knowledge that Satan exists and he's telling me to do something bad. That I don't have to commit to doing something bad or feel like I'm in a relationship with him in order to have good rational reasons to go, yeah, Satan exists and he's telling me to do something bad. So that epistemic question is totally separate from the other questions of, well, do I have a relationship with this thing that I know exists? Do I want a relationship? That's not relevant to today's topic and our use of Bayes' theorem. Even if it's theologically important and stuff, that's kind of an after step. What else do I have? Believe because okay, that was trusting. I think I covered it. Is hopefully anything else I missed? Oh, and even with the Calvinists, look, McAtack would be totally right in denying my real seeker notion. This is assuming a certain position in the Bible, but let's pretend Calvinism is totally true. Bayes' theorem is still right. McAtack got zapped by the Holy Spirit. I know this is a mischaracterization, but he got zapped by the Holy Spirit. God gave him 100% knowledge or whatever degree he had. I don't know if he accepts degrees, but he's got 100% knowledge that Christianity is true because of that action. And he's basing it on subjective probabilities. He knows. I guarantee you, he couldn't do the math and prove statistically that there's a 100% odds that every mathematician would agree that he exists. No, we all make these numbers. We have various considerations that we look at for and against a given proposition. And in one way or another, we all go, you know what? I think God doesn't exist, or I think no, Christianity, God raising someone from the dead, what a barbaric thing. No, Christianity's a bunch of hooey. Or in the opposite end, as me and Mac, as Christians, no, the evidence is more powerful than the negative things. There are counters to this, and we all make these weighted decisions. I'm just more transparent about it, and I assign actual probability values, which can be then plugged into Bayes' theorem and avoid further problems of bias in coming up with an overall probability. So I think this is generally applicable. It doesn't matter what the hypothesis is, and everyone should do this to be clear rather than just saying, I don't buy it kind of things. Okay, prove it. Assign numbers to the individual elements or aspects as to why you do this. And we would have lots better conversations and stuff like that. And yes, the probability values you plug in are subjective. That's totally right. Max writing that in the comments. But again, that's not a problem rationally. Everyone with a PhD in science, in history, in philosophy, logic, they all recognize the validity of using subjective probabilities. And whether you assign a real percent value or not, that's what everyone here has done. Darren and Andrew and David have all made, whether they recognize it consciously or not, or have actually assigned probability values, they've said the evidence makes it seem like Christianity is false overall. McAtack and I have done the opposite. The subjective probability I assigned to. So Darren, great, even if it's 0%. So Darren is saying, sorry, in the comments that he's assessed it at 0%. Great, 0% goes into Bayes' theorem. You plug it in and you get 0% overall, right? Even if you're convinced, if I convince you about the shroud, 55% or 60%, because you've got that, whatever gives you that 0%, however you got there, that's always going to outweigh, and the overall probability will be 0%. So guess what? Don't believe it. Apparently, Christianity has been proven with absolute proof to be false, according to Darren. So thank you for proving my point. You use Bayes, you just don't know it. You don't do it explicitly, kind of thing. So yeah, that's my point. Thank you guys for giving your feedback and stuff like that, and I'll think about ways to communicate this better in the future.
Well, I personally think that anything that helps us observe, recognize, and tame our biases is a good thing, which is why, even though I don't believe in the method, I'm willing to go through the method uh, and just see if there's a difference once I've tried my best to mathematically eliminate my biases. I don't think that's possible. I think my biases would show up in the math. Um, but I'm willing to try. And, if Dale is willing to, hold my
Absolutely.
hand through a 6-hour process, uh, I will do the thing and see, because bias,
Absolutely. Yeah.
these types of biases harm our decision-making ability, and you shouldn't be convinced, so convinced that you're right if you haven't done the work of doing your best to eliminate your biases. So, um, you know,
Yeah, I love that. I'll take all day if I need to help you guys out to
well,
understand it.
yeah,
Yeah.
I was said 6 hours generously. It's going to take us all day. But
Well, we can do multiple days. I'll
yeah,
short so with
so,
that. So,
but I'm looking forward to that. That's something that we'll do offline. I will be happy to report back on it. And I assure you that when I report back on it, it will be something that Dell has walked me through and that he has approved of, and that it won't be something that I just half-assed, as some kind of stunt. And so if I do not get Dale's approval of the process, then I will consider it illegitimate. So I'm willing to put that out there into the world. I am willing to put this podcast out there into the world. Thanks, everybody. And we will see you next time, maybe next month, because I think the stage has been set for finally, Dale and I finally getting down to the business of proving or disproving the existence of God. Bye-bye.